So the first, good morning. I have the pleasure of introducing you this presentation by Cairo. First of all, my level of English is not very good, so I am going to read you this presentation, and later Alberto, the course teacher, will act as a translator. Thank you very much for the effort to participate in this master's degree at the Polytechnic University of Madrid. Cairo is a forestry engineer from the ESF, State University of New York College of Environmental Sciences and Forestry, in addition to a master's degree in public administration. She's currently the city forester and urban forestry manager of a city of Portland. Portland is a city in the state of Oregon in the northwestern United States along the Columbia and Willamette rivers. It has an estimated 2015 population of 600,000 inhabitants and is the most populous city in the state of Oregon and the third largest in the Pacific Northwest region. It was named the Green City for being one of the greenest cities in the United States. We are looking forward to learning about the management model in this beautiful city in the United States, the importance of its trees, the involvement of the community, and the main initiatives to value the ecosystem services of urban forests. Thank you very much and glad to have you with us. Glenn.
Thank you for the introduction, Jose Luis. I'm sorry I don't speak Spanish. I wish I could. It would be easier.
Thank you for you.
I want to make sure that you are seeing the Spanish language version of the presentation. Is that correct?
Yeah, we are seeing the Spanish. Está diciendo Jane que vamos a ver la presentación en español. Ella hablará en inglés y yo, que soy Alberto, voy a tratar de traducir al final de cada diapositiva. Okay.
Okay, great. Yes, I have two screens up, one in English for me to follow and one for you in Spanish. So forgive me if it's a little rocky, but here we go. So this is an overview of the presentation. And I will bring this slide back up for you to see periodically to reorient you to the presentation because it has a few parts. First, I'll talk about Portland, Oregon briefly, then about Portland's forest, then about our urban forest management program in Portland, and then the parts of that program, which are science, planning, and policy, education and outreach, tree care and planting, and then finally at the end, I'll talk about challenges and opportunities we have managing the forest in Portland. Alberto.
Ok, este es el índice que lo vamos a ir viendo varias veces y nos va a servir de guía. Ok, carry on.
Great, thanks.
Luis, cierre un segundo. Ven, corre.
Some of this you heard from Jose Luis.
No.
We have a population density of 1,888 people per square kilometer. So compared to a lot of European cities, it's not densely populated. And other points I'll make is this picture is downtown Portland, and the big white mountain in the background that you see is Mount Hood. That is a quiet volcano. And I'll also point out that the Portland metro area rests on traditional village sites of the Multnomah, Klamath, Clackamas, Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, and many other indigenous tribes and bands. European colonization of Portland began in 1830, relatively recently. And in 1850, the Oregon Donation Land Act was passed. That removed the tribes and offered free land to white settlers, European settlers, for 2.5 million acres of tribal land that were not ceded by the local indigenous people.
Ok, es una ciudad que es poco densamente poblada. Al fondo lo que veis, al fondo es un volcán y toda esta zona sí que tenía bastantes tribus indígenas que nos ha ido diciendo de diferentes etnias y que con la colonización fueron reubicados en una zona que estaba un poquito a las afueras. Okay.
Thank you. One of the effects of European colonization of the area was removal of nearly all the trees that had been here along the Willamette River. That's the river you see here, the Willamette, and there's Mount Hood in the background and Mount Adams. And therefore it was called Stumptown. So Portland has not always been so green.
Lo que vemos es cuando llegó, digamos, el modelo de urbanización europea, pues prácticamente se cargaron todos los árboles, que algunos había centenarios, y que antes sí había sido más verde. Entonces la zona antigua del casco antiguo, como se hizo en 1890, pues tenía esta forma más heredada europea, pero casi sin árboles.
I would hope that you all know these things, but just to be sure, trees are essential city infrastructure for many reasons that we humans all require to live. Some of those reasons are the production of oxygen, improving air quality, absorbing greenhouse gases, reducing heat island effects in urban areas, reducing stormwater runoff, improving traffic safety, improving physical and mental health for humans, and of course, supporting wildlife and pollinators among them.
Hemos hecho un resumen de todos los beneficios que dan los árboles a la ciudad.
Okay, here's some information on Portland's forest. About a third of Portland is currently covered by tree canopy, while an average of over 50% could realistically be covered by tree canopy. We have 218,000 street trees. There are also approximately 90,000 vacant street tree spaces. There are almost 3 times as many trees in Portland on private property as there are in parks or other publicly owned property. And Portland's urban forest was valued at $5 billion US dollars in 2007. And we'll be updating that valuation soon through a partnership with the United States Forest Service.
La cobertura de árboles más o menos ahora ocupa el 30%, pero que debería de llegar al 50%. En eso están trabajando. Y luego, sobre todo, que prácticamente 2/3 de los árboles están en zonas privadas.
Okay. While we do have a few trees in Portland, they are not equitably distributed. About 50% of the trees in Portland are on the west side of the Willamette River that cuts through the city. And about 21% of the tree canopy is on the east side. 80% of Portlanders live east of the Willamette River. So the western part of the city is far better served by trees than the eastern part.
La distribución de los árboles no es equitativa ni es igual. A izquierda y derecha del río, donde vive menos gente hay muchos más árboles, y a la derecha, donde vive muchísima más gente, apenas hay el 21% de árboles.
Access to urban trees in Portland is inequitable, and it's highly linked to income. So as I said earlier, 54% canopy cover, or 56% removing one park, it's 54 on the west side, 21% on the east side. The dark green here is heavy canopy. The lighter green is less tree cover. And these are also, the darker green areas are typically the more affluent neighborhoods of the city, while the light green areas are the least affluent and also most racially diverse neighborhoods in the city.
Como vemos, la zona verde oscura es donde hay más árboles, y esos más árboles son las zonas un poco más caras de la ciudad. Las zonas de verde más clarito, donde menos árboles hay y donde hay una población más distribuida en diferentes etnias que a veces con poder adquisitivo inferior.
And here's an image of that. To the left, Eastmoreland is a more affluent neighborhood. You can see it has far more trees. And on the right is the Lentz neighborhood, which is in outer East Portland, has far fewer trees, a lot more hardscapes, and is a lot hotter in the summer, and also has a lot lower income levels.
Lo que estábamos viendo antes es la distribución de los árboles. La parte de la izquierda es una zona que es con más dinero, más árboles y es más fresca en verano. La parte de la derecha hace mucho más calor, se ve mucho más asfalto y son las zonas más deprimidas.
Okay. So at this point, I'll stop before moving into our forestry program in case anyone has any questions.
Si alguien tiene alguna pregunta, vamos a hacer algunas paradas a lo largo, entonces las podéis escribir o directamente las preguntáis directamente o en español o en inglés, como queráis, pero esto lo vamos a ver varias veces. Si alguien tiene alguna pregunta, lo puede hacer en este momento si queréis. Okay, Jane, I think that we carry on.
Okay, we'll carry on. Here's the overview again. We're moving into the Urban Forestry Management Program in Portland.
Vale, seguimos viendo el índice y lo seguimos.
Okay. This is actually from our website, and I put it in here in case you wanted to follow up later and check out the website. There's a lot of information about the full extent of our program there. Portland Parks and Recreation Urban Forestry's mission, our mission, is to manage and ensure Portland's urban forest infrastructure for current and future generations. And our urban forest in Portland currently consists of 218,000 street trees, 1.2 million park trees, and 2.9 million private property trees. You see that right here.
Vale, este es un pantallazo de la página web que lo podéis ver arriba, que es portland.gov, y ahí tenéis toda la información de la que vamos a ir nutriéndonos a lo largo de la presentación.
Okay, and urban forestry is in the Portland Parks and Recreation Department. Our city is split up into different departments and bureaus. Since most of the trees in Portland that are publicly owned are on Parks property, we are in the Parks Department. And we are comparable in Portland to other city structures that manage drinking water, wastewater and sewage, and also traffic and transportation ways. Forestry is the fourth part. Go ahead.
Sorry, el dato que hemos dado antes de la cantidad de árboles que hay en la zona pública y privada, luego también densidad de gente, etcétera, se asemeja mucho de la ciudad de Portland al resto de ciudades americanas. Entonces, esto sí que puede servir más o menos para hacernos una idea de cómo está en otros lugares.
Thank you. And you can see here some of the primary functions that urban forestry provides for Portlanders. On the left is an example of tree regulation, so laws around trees. In the middle is an example of tree maintenance, a tree climber caring for a tree. And on the right is an example of a tree planting program.
Vale, vemos aquí tres ejemplos de cómo se gestiona, digamos, la parte de arbolado. Este árbol que está en la zona privada, pero vemos ahí un cartel que estará explicando probablemente algún tipo de gestión de este árbol. Luego de trabajos aéreos y lo de la derecha veis cómo se cuadrillas de plantación de árboles.
Thank you. Oh, okay. This is how our program is organized. The city forester oversees and leads the entire program. We have one group that focuses on permits and regulations, so city laws around trees, including prohibiting removal of certain trees or requiring planting of trees. We have a separate group that's responsible for tree maintenance, and that includes 24/7 emergency response for trees that fall on roads or elsewhere in the city. And then the third group is science, outreach, and planting. And they work on research, things like the extent of canopy cover, which we evaluate every 5 years, create specifications and policies, and also lead our citywide planting programs. You can see here planting is the top picture, in the middle is another maintenance picture, and on the bottom right is our Volunteer Urban Forestry Commission. These are Portlanders who give their time for free to advise us on forest practices.
Okay, while I translate, Jane, I think there is a question. I'm going to translate and you can check on the chat and then we answer that. Aquí lo que veis es el organigrama de cómo está dividido, digamos, el departamento. Y entonces sería los permisos de regulación, que es básicamente la parte burocrática. El mantenimiento tiene que estar las 24 horas del día porque hay árboles que pueden caer a lo largo para que no corten el tráfico. Y luego de la derecha, sobre todo, es toda la parte de divulgación y plantación con determinados colectivos. Y teníamos una pregunta. We have a question.
I see that. How strong are laws about private green areas? I'm going to cover that a little later, so hang on to that question. If I don't cover it enough, you can ask again then.
Ok, nos han preguntado de cómo son de restrictivas las leyes y entonces ha dicho que luego le toca explicarlo, o sea que luego lo veremos.
Okay, one of the responsibilities we have in the urban forestry group is being the single point of contact for all tree information in the city. Any resident, property owner, visitor who has questions or concerns or wants to report complaints about trees can call this number or email us. We also have a robust website.
Vale, lo que es importante, la gestión del arbolado de la ciudad de Portland se gestiona a través de un teléfono único y de un correo electrónico único. Por lo tanto, cualquier incidencia, todo se canaliza a través del mismo sistema.
Okay, I mentioned before tree emergencies. This is another key service that our group is responsible for. And here you see what I mean by tree emergency. Here's a tree that uprooted from a park and fell across the street onto a building. And these are our crews out there with equipment to remove that tree and clear the road.
Vale, pues lo que estábamos comentando antes de que tiene que haber un servicio de 24 horas de mantenimiento, pues esto es un árbol de gran porte que cae y que necesitas ir con una brigada propia para llegar y hacer el apeo y cortarlo y abrir el tráfico otra vez.
Okay, getting back to tree regulations. This is an introduction to that. There'll be more later in the presentation. But in Portland, we have titles. They're groups of laws that are related to each other. Title number 11 in the city is the city's tree code or tree regulations, tree laws. And you can see here who's responsible for what types of regulations under that code. Private property trees. So those are on properties owned by individuals, not by the city. There are regulations around preserving trees or paying mitigation or planting mitigation trees when a property is developed. Also, planting is required in some cases when a property is developed. So a new building is placed or a replacement made. And there are also some protection requirements around trees and development. In non-developed, should I let you go?
No, carry on.
Okay. And then also in non-development situations, there are protections around retaining certain trees. Permits are required in order to remove trees of a certain size, over 12 inches diameter breast height. And there are also some heritage trees. Those are specially named by our city council because they are of exceptional size or historic significance. And there are only 300 of them in the city. Those are also regulated.
Vale, nos están contando que hay diferentes formas de tratar el arbolado. El privado y el público a veces no tienen la misma normativa, aunque sí que hay árboles que están catalogados y esos sí que se tratan igual. Tienen 300 árboles catalogados en la ciudad y esos sí que tienen una restricción especial. Y además, pues bueno, en las plantaciones sí que tiene que llevar un tipo de plantación propia con unos catálogos, con unos protocolos que tienen que cumplir. Okay.
Thank you. And I will speak in more detail about regulations in a little bit. So hang on to those questions yet.
Vale, ahora hablaremos un poquito más de las regulaciones en las siguientes pantallas.
Okay, here you can see our budget, annual budget. And how it is roughly allocated across our program areas. So at present, our budget consists of roughly $13 million a year, which the internet tells me is over 11 million euros. And most of that goes to our tree maintenance operations. Permitting and regulation is also a large part of that. And then planting is the third largest component at 21%. Science, community, and community stewardship, so public programs with trees, are a smaller component, and policy is 3%.
Vale, pues básicamente el presupuesto es de 11.400.000 euros y entonces está en esas 5 partidas, ¿no? Sobre todo lo que más se lleva es el mantenimiento de los árboles y luego pues los permisos y regulación el 24%, la plantación 21% y luego lo que es divulgación, etcétera, y ciencia el 14%, ¿no?
A little bit about our team. This is from March of 2021, so it's a little outdated. At the time, we had 52 full-time staff. Right now, we're increasing to 70 full-time staff. But here you can see an example of the types of qualifications that our staff have.
Vale, son 70 personas las que trabajan, esto está actualizado del año pasado, entonces en cada barra más o menos podéis ver el tipo de persona que está vinculada. Sorry, Jean, I'm going to ask you something because I have a question.
Yep.
These 70 people that you have here is people only looking after the trees, or they look after as well the prairies and the grass and the flowers, or not only the trees?
Good question. Thank you.
Carry on the nature
Okay.
side, sorry.
In Portland, the urban forestry program only deals with trees. Others deal with other things like shrubs and grasses.
Ok, vale. Entonces le he hecho la pregunta de esto de aquí y de la pasta que hemos visto antes, si esto es solo, porque estamos hablando de arbolado, estamos hablando no estamos hablando ni de praderas, ni de siegas, ni de flores, ni de otro. Entonces, esto el Ayuntamiento de Portland lo tiene como arbolado, como una cosa propia. Los 11 millones y pico que hemos visto es solo de arbolado. El mantenimiento de praderas, flores, arbustos, entiendo, y otras cosas, eso va por otro lado y eso lo mantiene otro departamento. Todo lo que lleva Jane es solo de arbolado. Ok.
Yep. We work closely with other groups that manage things like turf or rose gardens or community gardens, which are produce plots that individuals can rent.
Vale. Que ellos trabajan también de la mano con los otros departamentos que llevan también plantaciones de flores, etcétera, pero que esto es un departamento propio, el de arbolado.
I see a question. Do you use specific species for public trees depending on the place and use it's going to have? Yes, we do. And I will speak to that in a little bit.
Vale, hemos hecho la pregunta si se utiliza algún determinado tipo de árbol y dice que sí, que lo veremos ahora.
Okay, back to our overview. We've covered the first three parts, the third being a large overview. Now I'm going to focus on our science, planning and policy group.
Vale, nos vamos a centrar ahora en la tercera parte, la ciencia, planificación y la política.
The city of Portland has an urban forest management plan that is the vision and guide for everything we do in urban forestry to manage trees. It has 3 goals. You can see these 3 overarching goals here. The plan is pretty old. It's from 2004, and we are planning to update it starting in 2023.
Vale. Sobre todo ellos tienen, la visión principal tiene estos 3 objetivos, que aunque se marcaron en el año 2004, pues de momento siguen siendo vigentes y que dentro de poco pues los van a ir actualizando.
I wanted to point out that the photograph here is from Forest Park, which is a park in the western part of the city, west of the Willamette. It is a 5,200 acre park. It's the largest urban park in the United States. And it looks like that. It's pretty wild.
Vale, lo que vemos en la foto es un parque, ahora no me acuerdo el nombre, pero que tiene 5.800 hectáreas. Y alguno de los que me estáis escuchando, si no os habéis quedado frito, traducir 5.800 hectáreas, no, perdona, acres, 5.800 acres, a ver cuántas hectáreas nos sale, porque es el parque, uno de los parques más grandes urbano, o es el parque más grande urbano que está en Estados Unidos. Y entonces ahora, cuando alguien lo ponga en el chat, miraremos cuántas hectáreas tiene. Okay, we are guessing how many hectares is in acres. Okay.
Sorry, I didn't convert that. I meant to, I forgot. Big. Okay.
Aproximadamente media hectárea, Alberto.
Media hectárea no puede ser. 5.800 acres.
Pues podemos
un acre
estar
son 4.000 y pico metros, me parece.
Pues podemos irnos a la mitad, en torno a casi 3.000 hectáreas. O sea, es un gran parque.
5.800, sí, unas 2.800 hectáreas. Vale, sí, por ahí. Ok, 2,800 hectares, more or less. Huge.
Thank you. It's quite big. It's lovely. We're very lucky to have it. Okay, I wanted to give an example of the types of things we do in our science planning and policy group. So I mentioned earlier that we have assessed the tree canopy potential in the city. And we did that looking at development regulations, roadways, all sorts of things where trees cannot be planted. So we took that area out. So it's a reasonable assessment of how much tree cover we could have. Remember, our current canopy cover is around 30%, but potentially we could have 52% canopy cover. And you can see here the breakdown. It's 62% potentially on private land. That's the largest component. Most of that in residential areas, not commercial or industrial areas. And most of that potential canopy space is east of the Willamette River where canopy is lowest. Altogether, we calculate space for 1.3 million more trees in Portland.
Vale, han hecho una planificación de dónde se pueden plantar árboles, que es lo importante, porque tienen un 30% de cobertura de árboles, pero para llegar a ese 50%, estimado un poquito más, entonces están con planos, miran diciendo dónde no, primero han marcado dónde no se pueden plantar. Y donde no se pueden plantar, pues ponen pues, evidentemente las zonas industriales, zonas de tráfico denso, zonas que no pueden caber, pero todos los demás son susceptibles de plantar, y aunque sean zonas privadas, ahí es donde se van a centrar en plantar más de 1 millón de árboles.
Thank you. Sorry, I jumped ahead there. Yeah, the reason that's important, of course, is we're working towards more canopy. And so knowing what we might be able to achieve and being able to plan a strategy to get there is critical. Do you want to say that, Alberto, or no?
Not really. Sorry,
Okay.
can you? Yeah.
No worries, we'll keep going. Okay, so now we're getting towards species and another important aspect of our management responsibilities. Managing for forest resilience. And here's an example from the Midwest of the United States, Ohio, Toledo, Ohio, from 2006, where they have the streets planted all with ash trees. All of these are the same species. You can tell they look very similar, big, beautiful trees, and I'm sure these folks really love their trees.
Ok, pues esta es un ejemplo de alguna que está en Ohio, en Toledo. Entonces, de algún ejemplo de cómo pueden hacerse algún tipo de plantaciones. Entonces es el ash tree, que es que no sé cuál es la traducción al castellano de ese árbol, y entonces pues me está explicando cómo puede hacerse. Ok, la haya, era haya.
Thank you. Yes, and so we see just 3 years later, all of those ash trees are dead because of the emerald ash borer, which is an invasive insect that bores into trees and eventually kills them. Of course, pests and pathogens are a constant concern in urban forests. And this is an example of why species diversity in tree planting is so important. If these weren't all ash trees, not all would have been lost at one time.
Vale, pues si son hayas o fresnos, que vosotros lo sabréis, lo que ha dicho es que todos se han muerto, ¿vale? La foto anterior estaban todos bien, que ahora se han muerto todos. Y entonces se han muerto todos porque les ha atacado un tipo de bacteria o de insecto. Ahora no me ha quedado del todo claro. Y entonces que eso es porque son todos iguales y se han ido contagiando todos. Entonces que es una de las cosas muy importantes tener una variedad de arbolado diferente para que tengas diferente biodiversidad. Sorry, Jean, this tree was ash, A-S-H.
ASH, Fraxinus is the genus.
Fraxinus.
Es fresno.
Fresno.
Fraxinus excelsior, Fraxinus angustifolia.
Okay.
Son
Yeah.
fresnos.
Okay, we carry on.
In this case, probably Fraxinus americana, American white ash, in those pictures. And here in Portland, one of the things we're responsible for is managing that species distribution so that there is increased resilience. Here's an example of one neighborhood in Portland. It's called the Hollywood neighborhood, not to be confused with California. And with the help of many resident volunteers, we inventoried all the street trees and evaluated how vulnerable this neighborhood was to large-scale tree loss. And you can see here, anything that's red on the map is vulnerable to at least 2 known pests that are present in the United States and expected to come to Oregon: emerald ash borer, also the Asian longhorn beetle. The green dots are trees that have no known vulnerability. So this neighborhood would lose a little more than half of its canopy if those 2 beetles came to town.
Vale, esto el Departamento de Oregón lo que hace en su departamento es, por ejemplo, hace un mapeo de todos los barrios y cada puntito que veis ahí es un árbol. Los que están en verde son árboles que no tienen, digamos, enfermedades conocidas o que no están en zonas vulnerables, o no zonas, sino enfermedades que pueden ser vulnerables. Los rojos son árboles que o bien pueden tener ya una enfermedad o bien son susceptibles de que lo vaya a tener y que ellos son conscientes de que la mayoría de los árboles que están marcados en rojo van a tener una enfermedad.
Another example of the work of our science planning and policy group is park tree inventories. So I talked about street tree inventories. We also inventory trees on public properties. We have chosen to do that largely with volunteers. There are 175 developed parks in Portland. That's not counting natural areas like that really large park I talked about before. We don't inventory those the same way. But we had, over a span of a few years, 800 volunteers that we trained and assisted in collecting inventory on all the trees in all of the developed parks. Again, this is important because you can't manage what you don't know. And now we're better able to understand what species diversity is needed, as well as things like age class of trees.
Me está contando que es importante, tienen un trabajo ingente, sobre todo de inventariar todos los árboles que tienen, pero son tantos que lo que hacen es recurren a los voluntarios. Entonces ahí tienen más de 800 voluntarios que han ayudado a catalogar la mayoría de los árboles. Evidentemente han recibido una formación previa. Lo que veis en el mapa en verde es los parques y zonas que han sido inventariadas por el personal del ayuntamiento de ellos. Y lo que veis en rosa es los voluntarios. Los voluntarios han inventariado toda la zona.
Okay. I see a question here too. What were the variables the volunteers took from the inventory? So they measured diameter at breast height, 4.5 feet off the ground of the trunks of the trees. They managed heights of the trees, canopy spread, genus, and if they could, species, but not in all cases because that was too difficult for volunteers. And they also collected an assessment of health, which was very basic.
Vale.
Poor, dead, poor, good.
Vale, entonces han preguntado que cómo participan los voluntarios y qué labor hacen. Entonces hacen como una ficha que miden el diámetro del tronco a 1,20 más o menos del suelo. Dan una opción del estado del árbol, ahora no recuerdo, que van mirando y que si saben con certeza el tipo de árbol que es, lo ponen, pero que si no, pues que no lo ponen. Pero claro, luego los que se dedican a esto normalmente saben de árboles. Sorry, Jen, I have a question.
Yes.
These volunteers, le voy a preguntar cómo hacen esta ficha. These volunteers, when they receive, for example, the information to do the inventory of each tree, do they receive formation? Do you teach them how to do it, or do they receive it by, how do you do it, by mobile, by tablet, or how do they do it?
Yes, good questions. We train all the volunteers. We have training days with staff, and they use iPads, so tablets in the field to collect information. We train them on the tablets. We train them as well on how to collect the information on each tree. And we also do frequent quality assessment and quality control. So our staff come out and check that the volunteers are collecting correctly.
Vale, sí que hacen una formación de campo y formación con iPads y con tablets. Entiendo que se descargan una aplicación y entonces les dicen lo que tienen que hacer y luego también hay un trabajo constante. Además entiendo que también cada voluntario que marca un árbol queda con su firma o con su número y por lo tanto habrá voluntarios que acertarán y habrá alguno pues, que fallará. Entonces el que fallará pues supongo que le darán una colleja o le formarán un poquito mejor.
Okay. I should let you know also that there's a reason we use volunteers for this kind of thing instead of professionals. It would be a lot quicker if it were our staff or consultants, professional consultants that we hired. However, we find immense value in teaching residents of Portland about trees and making them into good tree stewards and advocates for trees in their neighborhoods. And this is one of the ways we do that.
El departamento que lo lleva era uno de esos que hemos visto de ciencia y divulgación, que es el que forma a los voluntarios y para ellos es muy importante que la gente se involucre. Por lo tanto, saben que pueden hacerlo con empresas exteriores que te hagan un GIS, que te hagan esta información, pero pretenden involucrar a todo el mundo y a la gente de la importancia de los árboles. Entonces ese dinero, en lugar de pagárselo a alguien de fuera, lo dedican a formación de la gente propia, local.
Thanks. Okay, another example of what that part of urban forestry does is street tree inventory. These also are done often with volunteers. And here you see the data outcomes and our analysis from those. So we collected information, including with volunteers, on all 218,000 street trees, and we're able to then see what our species makeup was. And you can see in the pie chart up on the right, we have a lot of maple trees, and then smaller amounts of other very common street tree species. This is a challenge, as you saw in earlier slides, a problem, because if something like Asian longhorn beetle, which favors maple species, Acer species, comes to Portland, we will lose 28% of our canopy, give or take, in a very short time. So we collect this information so that we can work to change it and improve forest diversity, which I'll get to in the next slide.
Básicamente, la labor de los voluntarios, además de saber dónde hay un árbol, es qué tipo de árbol es y qué tipo de, digamos, qué condiciones tiene. Allí, por ejemplo, veis en esa gráfica el tipo, el que más hay es el maple, que era el arce, cherry, que son las, espera que se me lo sé, cereza, pera, plum y el ciruelo, eso. Y ash, que es el fresno. Y los demás son árboles de todo tipo, que ahora no voy a decirlos porque me voy a parecer un erudito. Okay, we carry on.
Okay, good. What we're aiming for in terms of street tree diversity in Portland is no more than 5% of one species, no more than 10% of one genus, and no more than 15% of one family.
So, sorry, the last one, no more than 10%, but you have 28% of maple. So,
right, that means we have a lot of work to do.
So you want to put it down?
That's right. 28% maple is very risky. It's too many eggs in one basket, right? That's okay. 28% Acer. We want that number to be no more than 10% Acer.
Okay. Vale, entonces, perdón, sí, lo que quieren ellos es fomentar la biodiversidad y que tratan de que los árboles sean menos del 10%. Tienen el maple, que era el fresno, ¿no? Era que tienen el 28%, que ellos se dan cuenta de que es muchísima cantidad, es un porcentaje muy alto y que los van a ir sustituyendo para que llegue al 10%. Y entonces el número ideal de los árboles está entre el 5 y el 10%, porque cuando hay una enfermedad o cuando les ataca a algún árbol en particular, cuando fuera sobre el fresno, que tienen tanta población, casi el 30%, tendrían un problema muy grave. Entonces lo que están haciendo es reduciendo esos y poniendo de los otros.
And maple is genus Acer, cherry is genus Prunus, pear is Pyrus, plum is another Prunus, ash, Fraxinus, crab apple is Malus. Is that right? I think so. Linden is Tilia, dogwood is Cornus, birch is Betula, and hawthorn is Crataegus.
Vale, eso no lo traduzco, pero
perfect.
Está dando los nombres en latín de todos los árboles. Okay.
That's why we have Latin names, right? Scientific names, so we all know them.
El máximo por familia del 5 al 10. The maximum is between 5 to 10% per different tree, yeah? Per species.
What we're aiming for, what we want to get to, is no more than 5% of one species.
No más del 10%, sorry, I repeat it, no more than 5% per species.
Correct.
No más del 5% por especie, okay? And the other one was family and there was species.
Genus, 5% species, no more than 10% of one genus, and no more than 15% of one family.
Vale, no más del 15% de una familia, no más del 10% de un tipo y no más del 5% de algo.
Sí, de un género.
Eso,
y
de un género.
De una especie. Familia, género, especie. Family, genus and species.
Estoy en preescolar de árboles, entonces ya disculparéis. Venga, ok, carry on.
And that, again, that's all about resilience, so that the next pest or pathogen or climate impact, we have a better chance of keeping more trees than losing a lot at one time. And here's one of the key ways that we are trying to recognize that goal. In Portland, all street trees are city property. They're regulated by us. So any tree planting or removal or even pruning of a tree along a street requires permits from urban forestry. And when planting happens in the street, they must use these species lists. And these lists have species selected according to the site size. So smaller species of trees go in smaller spaces, larger trees go in larger spaces, and also whether there are overhead power lines, which we have in a lot of US cities, and we have in Portland. Shorter trees go under power lines. Where there are no power lines, the list will have taller trees at maturity. And the lists have many, many different species, as many as we think will work for each of those scenarios, so that our forest becomes more diverse. There are no maples, no acer on any of the lists until that 28% comes down.
Vale, a ver si luego, porque ha habido un montón de información. Vamos a ver, los árboles. Hay un listado de árboles que se pueden poner en la ciudad. Entonces, además, cuando se va a plantar, todos los árboles públicos tienen que ser el listado que está regulado. Después, hay zonas para árboles grandes, si la zona es grande. Si hay Alcor, que son zonas pequeñas, hay árboles pequeños. Y luego hay una problemática en las ciudades de Estados Unidos que tienen cables aéreos que cruzan, y en ese sitio donde hay cables aéreos solo se pueden poner arbolitos que crezcan muy poco para que no lleguen a tocar esos árboles. Y luego algo más que no me acuerdo, pero me lo voy a inventar. No me lo invento, anda, que ya se me ocurrirá. Ok, Jane, we carry on.
Okay. I'm seeing a statement from Patrizio, most are deciduous. That is true, most are deciduous. We do have evergreen species, needled, as well as broadleaf evergreen species that we are trying to get more planted in the city. So those are on the list as well. They're not as popular with most people, so we have work to do to get more of them in. They also can create some traffic and line of sight concerns.
Ok, y ahora ya me he acordado lo que estaba diciendo antes, que por ejemplo de los fresnos que tienen el 28% ya no se plantan más en la ciudad hasta que eso baje por debajo llegue al 10%. Y hay alguna otra especie que también tienen muchos, para fomentar la biodiversidad. ¿Vale? Y ahora seguimos. Ok, we carry on.
Okay, I'm switching now to regulation. So laws around trees. And here is an example of a situation where permits are required from urban forestry and why. On the left is a beautiful street tree. Permits are required to do any work on that tree, to prune it, certainly to remove it. Unless there are very compelling reasons, the removal permits are not issued. In other words, people cannot cut trees down unless the tree is dead or dying or dangerous, or causing some sort of infrastructure conflict that can't be resolved another way. The tree on the right, that's illegal. That tree would be considered a removal. The person did not get a permit for it, the property owner, and they would have violations as well as mitigation steps to take. They would have to pay a certain amount of money and also plant a tree to replace that one.
Ok, lo que veis, hablamos de regulación. No se puede mover un árbol sin permiso, no se puede cortar, no se puede tocar, sobre todo un árbol ya consolidado. Por ejemplo, lo que veis a la derecha, el árbol este que está medio podado, que está medio muerto, se dice que es un ejemplo típico de alguien, aunque está en una parcela particular, ese árbol va a tener una multa al dueño, le van a crujir y además luego tendrá que plantar algún otro árbol en algún otro sitio. Porque aunque ese árbol esté en una propiedad privada, le va a tener que pedir permiso al ayuntamiento, pues un árbol consolidado para tocarlo.
And I'm confident that if we didn't have regulations on trees in Portland, Portland would not be as green as it is. We would see a lot more of what's on the right than on the left, mostly because of ignorance.
Vale, que gracias a estas leyes que son bastante estrictas y que suelen poner multas, si no fuera por eso, Portland sería una ciudad mucho menos verde, y que gracias a estas cosas que son tan restrictivas, se están salvando pues, probablemente miles de árboles todos los años.
Okay, this is an overview of what tree activities are regulated in Portland that require permits from urban forestry. Pruning of any street tree or public property tree, not private property. Planting of trees in any street or public property. Removal of trees on any street, public property, or private property when the tree is larger than 12 inches diameter breast height, which is about the size of a dinner plate. If it's bigger than that, it's regulated. If it's smaller, it's not. Root cutting of any street or public property trees requires permits from us. Attaching lighting or other things to any public street or public property trees requires permits. And also the application of any chemicals, pesticides or other things requires permits when it's a public property tree.
Estas son las acciones que llevan a cabo desde el departamento y que solo pueden hacer ellos, ¿no? Que es que podar, plantar, remover árboles, cortar cualquier tipo de rama, poner luces de estas de Navidad o cualquier tipo de pesticida. Todo eso, los únicos que están autorizados son el departamento.
In general, the tree regulations are most restrictive when it's a street or public property tree and less restrictive on private property trees. Private property trees, some of these things are not required. Mostly it's just removal of trees that are larger than a certain size.
Todo esto es evidentemente, sobre todo en los árboles en zonas públicas. Los que están en zonas privadas, digamos que tienen una normativa mucho más laxa y a veces no se cumple.
Okay, so we see here more information about private tree regulation. As I said earlier, removal of a private tree of a certain size, this one is certainly much larger than 12 inches diameter breast height, requires a permit. So if the tree on the left wasn't permitted by urban forestry, then they will have violation fines and have to do replanting of trees. Obviously, this tree cannot be replaced. This looks like it was a big red oak. Any tree that's planted will take decades to get that large again, if it even makes it. And that's what you see on the right. When trees are permitted for removal, mitigation is required. Mitigation can take the form of planting tree or trees to quote unquote replace the tree that was removed, and or paying into a fund that we use to plant trees on public properties and private properties in the city.
Do you plant as well in private properties, Jen?
We do, yes.
Yeah. Vale, lo que hemos visto antes, el árbol de la izquierda, que es un roble rojo que se lo han cargado sin permiso. Todo árbol que sea más grande de 12 pulgadas y media, que es como un plato de cena, más o menos, para que nos hagamos una idea, no lo puedes tocar sin permiso. Entonces tiene que tener el permiso del ayuntamiento, aunque sea en zona privada, aunque sea en tu jardín. Entonces por ejemplo, de aquí, que es un árbol enorme, él lo ha cortado y va a tener también una multa. Y los de la derecha son árboles que se plantan en zonas públicas y van con sus tutores, y esos son el tipo de árbol que se puede poner.
So private property tree planting is required in many cases when a tree on private property is permitted for removal. And then with the money that's paid into our planting fund, we voluntarily plant. We have trees planted with voluntary property owners. So property owners will elect to have a tree planted and will provide the tree for that on their property.
Vale, también lo que ha comentado es que incluso en zonas privadas, que tú tampoco puedes quitar el árbol, también cuando el ayuntamiento hace plantaciones de árboles, también puede plantar en zonas privadas. Entonces hay una especie de acuerdo con el ayuntamiento para que se pueda plantar en zonas privadas con árboles públicos.
And this is the most controversial part of Portland's tree regulations, the private property regulations. The reason that private property trees are regulated is, as you may recall from earlier in my presentation, most of Portland's forest is indeed on private property. If we weren't regulating tree removal from those properties, Portland would not have nearly the forest it has today.
Sí, que es, lo que es una de las medidas que son más controvertidas. Lo que se ha dicho de la regulación de los árboles privados aquí en Estados Unidos considera que lo que es privado es privado. Entonces, eso es como una invasión del ayuntamiento en tus árboles, que son tuyos, pero que si no fuera por este tipo de protección que realiza el ayuntamiento sobre estos árboles, aunque sea en tu jardín, Portland no tendría árboles. Entonces, bueno, ellos son conscientes. Es una fuente constante de conflictos, pero también es una fuente de que tengan árboles grandes.
Okay, we're moving on now to education and outreach. Are there any
Yeah. ¿Alguno va a preguntar algo? Sorry.
Thank you.
Sí, yo quería preguntar una cosilla. Ya que tienen una ordenanza municipal que tienen tan claro que no puedes quitar árboles privados, y como he visto que sí hay gente que lo quita, ¿eso lo hacen porque las multas son muy pequeñas o por desconocimiento de la normativa o porque no le importa meterse en los litigios ahí?
Yeah. Vale, pregunta. Jane, they are asking me, when people in private properties cut a tree, is because they don't know, because they don't care, or because they don't mind to pay a fine and the tree is just in the middle of the way?
All three.
Vale, las tres. Le pasa porque no lo sabe, porque les da la gana o porque quieren quitarlo porque igual les mancha. Las tres. Entonces, how much is, for example, the fine of cutting the tree that we have seen before, that red oak? La puede preguntar cuánto es la multa de cortar el roble rojo que hemos visto antes en la diapositiva.
So I'm going to estimate. Let's assume that tree was healthy and it's a large tree. The mitigation payment is by inch. So the larger the tree, the higher the payment. The healthier the tree, the higher the payment. Or if it's damaged, it would be less. But for that tree, I'm going to estimate it would be maybe $4,000 or $5,000 they're required to pay, as well as plant another tree.
Vale. El árbol que hemos visto, el roble rojo, ese que era un árbol grande, se paga por si el árbol está dañado. Si está súper sano y te lo carga, pues entonces te crujen más. Si estaba enfermo, etcétera, pues igual es un atenuante, pero tendrás que pedir permiso. Pero si ya te lo has cargado, tendrás que demostrar que estaba muerto. El que hemos visto, no lo sabía exactamente, pero rondará de $4,000 a $5,000 de multa y además plantar un árbol nuevo. El que hemos visto ese del roble rojo, ese que estaba en una casa privada. Ok.
Okay. And Estelle, we think that most of the time when there are code violations, it's because people don't know. And one of the things we're hoping to do in the future is a very broad publicity campaign about why trees are good, why people should want to keep them, how to take care of them, and that they must get permits to do tree work.
Vale. Una de las cosas que ellos están trabajando, que creen que la mayoría de las veces que la gente corta un árbol es por desconocimiento de que no lo pueden cortar. Por lo tanto, quieren trabajar más en divulgar y en sensibilizar a la gente de que si van a cortar un árbol privado tienen que pedir permiso y tienen que saber el porqué.
Okay, we're a little over halfway through, and now we're shifting into our education and community stewardship programs. I have a few slides of examples of those programs. This first one here is what we call the Portland Pruners program. These are folks that we train and work usually on a weekend morning with one of our seasonal staff to prune with hand tools only safely street trees so that they meet clearance heights.
All these are volunteers.
Yes.
Okay. Vale, estamos viendo un programa de voluntariado de poda de árboles que normalmente se hace en un fin de semana. Todos estos que vemos en amarillo son voluntarios y sí que hay un responsable del ayuntamiento con ellos y esto lo hacen solo con herramientas manuales, no cogen nada, ni trabajos en altura ni herramientas mecánicas, pero estos son trabajos voluntarios que hace la gente en su barrio.
And there, again, the reason I mentioned before why we do these types of public programs is to provide people with education and information about trees so that they become tree advocates and supporters. And also it helps us connect with residents so that they know about urban forestry and know that they may need permits. And also with street trees, Portland is a bit unique of cities in the US. Even though the street trees are city property, the adjacent property owner to the street tree is required to maintain it. And that doesn't happen a lot of times. So these folks are literally helping maintain street trees instead of the adjacent property owner.
Bueno, que el trabajo del voluntariado ellos piensan que es muy importante de divulgar, de difundir el mensaje y de, sobre todo, involucrar a la gente, que sepan. Si le enseñas a la gente y la gente quiere aprender, porque son voluntarios y quieren aprender, primero le están ahorrando también un dinero a la ciudad, que es importante, que eso es una de las cosas importantes, pero luego también, además de que se está difundiendo las ideas de cómo se debe hacer, la gente empieza a saber cómo se poda un árbol y aunque son estos árboles públicos, luego mucha de esta gente tiene árboles también en sus zonas privadas, por lo tanto se está expandiendo el mensaje.
Okay, another example of a community tree stewardship program is what we call neighborhood tree stewards. And every fall we have a class that's run evenings and weekends. It's usually a series of 7 or 8 classes that teach volunteers about tree regulations in the city, tree care, the value of trees, the services we all get from trees, so that they can be a liaison in their neighborhood and promote tree stewardship in with their neighbors.
Eso también, sobre todo, es parte de la divulgación. Va gente a los diferentes barrios, también en colegios, para enseñar a la gente cómo se planta árboles, ¿no? Entonces, eso es importante, difundir el mensaje para aprender desde el inicio.
Another example of a community stewardship program is what we call learning landscapes. And this is tree planting at school sites, usually, sometimes it's near school sites, with students, with pupils, usually in elementary school, sometimes in high school. And there's a curriculum component that goes with it, where we teach about tree planting, trees, the benefits of trees, tree care, so that hopefully these kids will grow up to be adults who love trees and make good decisions around them. Since 2007, we've done this program with over 100 schools and planted over 1,500 trees.
Vale, esto también es muy importante hacerlo con colegios, lo hacen prácticamente desde preescolar hasta el high school. Lo llevan haciendo desde el año 2007, han plantado más de 1.500 árboles y lo hacen normalmente en la zona de influencia de cada colegio o cada instituto. Y es importante que los niños aprendan desde el inicio el valor de los árboles y cómo cuidarlos y cómo plantarlos.
Okay, another example of our education and community stewardship programs is the Heritage Tree Program. Heritage trees have the highest level of legal protection in the city of Portland. They're designated heritage trees by our city government, by city council, upon the recommendation of the city forester. And we have a pretty stringent review process to bring trees to city council for designation. If I didn't say it, there are about 300 in the city. This is heritage tree number 198, an Oregon white oak, Quercus garryana, on the east side of the river. And you can't really see how big it is here. Big, beautiful tree. These are typically really unique or large or beautiful trees that the neighborhood values.
Vale, estos son los árboles que se había comentado antes, que son los árboles no me sale la palabra, de herencia, digamos, de árboles de patrimonio, perdona.
Sí,
patrimonio.
monumentales,
Sí,
singulares.
Eso, monumentales.
Parece un roble bastante singular.
Sí, eso, y que hay unos 300 en
Es un oak tree, ¿no?
It is a Quercus garryana, oak.
Okay.
White
oak tree.
Yeah.
Vale, y que hay unos 300 y que estos evidentemente están mucho más protegidos, que tienen como una matrícula, lo que veis ahí es el HT198, este es el número 198, y tienen como, están inventariados todos, en dónde están, cuáles son, y evidentemente estos, tanto si están en público como privado, tienen la misma tipo de protección, que están, digamos, tú no puedes ahí podar, ni tocar, ni un tratamiento fitosanitario, ni nada sin permiso.
And I'll mention that for heritage trees, permits are required for everything, any pruning or attachments, regardless of where they're located, whether it's a city property, publicly owned property, or private. And any violations of the tree regulations on heritage trees have much higher penalties associated with them. So a tree like this, if somebody cut it down without a permit, would probably be $20,000 or $30,000 in fines.
Vale, pues estos árboles están mucho más protegidos, que era lo que decíamos antes, que no se podían tocar, pero que si alguien, por ejemplo, este mismo árbol, alguien le da por talarlo, la multa está de los $20,000 a los $30,000, más o menos.
And those that are on private property are only designated as heritage trees with the permission of the property owner. We can't designate a heritage tree on private property if the owner isn't amenable.
Vale, que si tú tienes una propiedad privada y tienes un árbol monumental, antes de que se declare ese árbol, solo se declara el árbol monumental con el beneplácito del dueño. Me refiero, si el dueño antes de hacerlo no le ha dado el beneplácito, ese árbol no puede ser considerado. Una vez que está considerado y está en tu propiedad, aunque luego entiendo que vendas la propiedad, ese árbol sigue siendo un árbol de patrimonio. Entonces sigue protegido. Eso significa que te ayudan a cuidarlo, pero que también tú tienes que respetarlo. Sorry, Jane, it's a question for myself. If, for example, you want to do some pruning in a private heritage tree, you do it or the private owner do it?
The private owner does that work, but they must have a permit from urban forestry to do it, which describes what type of pruning activities are permitted. Vale. And we also maintain, Alberto, we have another program, it's called Local Tree Care Providers, where local commercial companies that do tree work go through our training program, and then we advertise them as having gone through the program. They also cannot have any code violations for the past year. And with heritage trees and other trees, we direct property owners to that list of companies so that we're more comfortable that the work will be good work.
Okay. Entonces, sí, lo que estamos diciendo, que si tú tienes un árbol protegido en tu zona, si lo quieres podar, tienes que pedir permiso digamos, al ayuntamiento. Ellos te dan el permiso, lo puedes hacer tú, pero ellos te derivan hacia empresas o hacia proveedores de jardinería locales que tienen como ese tipo de sello, entre comillas, de que ellos saben manejar un árbol de patrimonio. Por lo tanto, tú ya te lavas las manos y serán los otros los que lo hagan.
I think this is the final example of a tree education and community stewardship program that we have. And again, these are examples. There are others, but I wanted to give you some highlights. We focus on workforce development, and what that is creating the future arborists and urban foresters, the next generation. We have paid internships, paid seasonal staff positions working alongside permanent regular staff. Also something called the Youth Conservation Crew, which is paid summer work and tree education in arboriculture and urban forestry for high school students. And we typically focus on Black, Indigenous, other people of color, youth, and women. And we've been doing that for over 20 years in an attempt to help create that next generation of arborists, but also diversify our profession. In the US, arboriculture and urban forestry are historically white and male fields.
Vale, que para ellos es muy importante divulgar y transmitir los valores y invierten bastante dinero en lo que es la formación y sobre todo en formación de gente joven a través de programas digamos, de prácticas, y también se especializan sobre todo en diferentes etnias y gente de color, digamos, gente más desfavorecida, porque tradicionalmente el mantenimiento de árboles ha sido gestionado por hombres y blancos, y lo que se quiere es una diversidad cultural y de edad y que participen todos.
And the reason that we focus on particularly BIPOC and women and diversifying the field of urban forestry and of arboriculture is that we believe as public servants, we should reflect and represent everyone in our city. So we want our staff to be diverse like our city. And also, of course, trees matter to everyone. And so everyone needs to know about them and hopefully be involved in them professionally.
Es importante sobre todo en la gente que mantenga los árboles, que los árboles son de todos, pero que sea gente igual que el resto de los habitantes de la ciudad, que haya igual número de hombres, de mujeres y de las diferentes etnias o razas, etcétera, que estén en la ciudad, que todos estén involucrados y que no sea solo potestad de unos pocos.
Okay, I'm going to head into tree care and planting in a moment, second to the last of all the categories in my presentation. But before I do that, are there any other questions?
¿Alguien tiene alguna pregunta? Entraremos en cómo se cuidan los árboles, que es el penúltimo punto, pero si alguien tiene alguna cosa lo puede preguntar y si no lo metéis en el chat tranquilamente y ya está. Okay, we carry on. If you see any question, it will be typed on the chat.
Okay. So here we are down there. All right, I mentioned before, tree maintenance for us includes 24/7 tree emergency response throughout the city of Portland to any public property or street. And you can just see some examples of that kind of work here.
Sí, aquí estamos viendo las actividades que son las 24 horas que tienen que estar haciendo, pues se caen bastantes árboles y algunas acciones de apeo de árboles también.
And then also our group, Urban Forestry, is responsible for maintaining park and city-owned trees, not street trees. Remember, that's the adjacent property owner, I will say unfortunately, but trees in parks is our responsibility for the most part. You can see examples here of somebody climbing to remove what was probably a western red cedar and a street tree removal, probably an elm tree.
Pues que el departamento de ellos es lo que tiene que hacer. Todos los trabajos aéreos normalmente lo hacen. Voy a preguntar si tienen subcontratas o son ellos. Jane, do you have the people that they work on these trees? They are from directly from the council, or they are different companies that they work for do it?
Good question. These are our own staff. So they're folks in our work group that report to a manager who reports to me.
Vale, son gente propia del ayuntamiento, son trabajadores públicos, no son contratas.
Contractors are used for various things, not 24/7 emergency response and not for most routine park, public property tree maintenance. Sometimes when there is a city development project, for example, a new park is being built or a new building is being built on city property, sometimes contract arborists will do any tree work there. However, in those cases, that's all under our permits. So we're directing them how to do that work.
Vale, que normalmente los trabajos rutinarios, los trabajos de altura y los trabajos digamos, de emergencia, que son más delicados, siempre los hace directamente el ayuntamiento. Que sí que hay contratas también, evidentemente, pero que normalmente las contratas a veces hacen zonas nuevas y zonas bajo un estricto control que luego, digamos, antes de ser recibidas, tienen que haber tenido las pautas que marca el ayuntamiento.
And this slide is more of the same, basically. On the left is actually, that's Joe Mendez, one of our climbing arborists doing a tree removal near the Broadway Bridge over the Willamette River. And on the right is some heavy equipment being used to place a large tree with a large root ball for planting.
Vale, pues estamos viendo pues un par de fotos más de trabajos aéreos y de plantación con una grúa en Alcorques. There's a question, Jane. I don't know if you have seen it.
I do. What legislation do you have regarding the use of phytosanitary
Vale, le estamos
products?
preguntando qué tipo de legislación es para uso de productos fitosanitarios en Oregón.
Jose Luis, do you mean phytoremediation of toxins from the soil? I'm not familiar with phytosanitary.
Chemical products.
Oh, like applying them to trees, herbicides, pesticides, fungicides?
Yeah.
Good question.
Yes, pesticides.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So any city or street tree, a permit is required to do that. And we're very selective about what types of chemicals we'll allow. Private property chemical use isn't regulated by urban forestry. It's regulated by other entities in the city of Portland, and it's not as closely regulated.
And for the public, which kind of chemical can you use?
In Portland, herbicides, fungicides, and pesticides that are not neonicotinoids are generally allowed.
Vale. Let me translate it because this might be important. Okay. Hay dos tipos de normativa, la privada que no está regulada, que prácticamente, a no ser que debemos de poner algún veneno así muy chungo, pues entonces eso, lo privado no está regulado, pero en lo público sí que está regulado. Y entonces ahora sí que nos está explicando que hay un tipo de fungicidas. Ok, sorry, Jane, can you say which kind of products you are allowed to use in Oregon trees, chemical?
Yeah.
A ver,
Yeah,
no va a decirlos. Yeah.
It varies from city to city because it's locally legislated, locally regulated.
Está
There-
legislado en cada ciudad, tiene sus propias leyes.
Anyone who's commercially applying chemicals has to have an Oregon State pesticide applicator's license, which all of our people do.
Los que ponen los productos, o sea, que hay gente que pone productos, tienen que tener una licencia para ponerlo.
And in Portland, neonicotinoids are not allowed. So those are the things where you see mass bee kills, for example, honeybees. Those are illegal in any situation.
Los que atacan a las abejas están prohibidos.
However, other things like glyphosate are still permitted and widely used.
Vale, glifosato está permitido y se usa bastante.
I don't agree with that, and I'm working on changing it, but that's the way that is.
De que Glenn no está de acuerdo con ello y que ya trata de cambiar la ley, pero ya de momento no lo puede hacer.
In
You know, it's
parks,
forbidden in the most of cities in Europe and in
say
Spain.
that again. Say that again.
Glyphosate.
It's not allowed
It's-
in Europe, right? For the most
No.
part. Yeah, I know. I keep saying that. Like, if they don't think it's a good idea, why do we? Also, on parks property, public park property, there are stricter rules around what can be used and when. We do something called integrated pest management, which favors using natural controls like ladybugs and things like that for pest management. And chemicals are a last resort and only in certain locations, like
Vale.
not near waterways.
So let me translate because I think this is important for all of us. This is much
Okay.
that we... A ver, que sí que utilizan fitosanitarios, o sea, mariquitas, ¿vale? Supongo será Adalia bipuntata, is ladybug that one? Adalia bipuntata o no? Bueno,
Y eso es todo lucha integrada, eso es todo
vale.
control biológico.
Vale, pues
con
entonces que eso sí
insectos.
que lo utilizan, pero claro, los glifosatos están permitidos. Entonces, do you know, Jane, this is a question, how many cities in the US are using as normal glyphosates? ¿Cuántas ciudades en Estados Unidos utilizan de manera regular los glifosatos?
I'm going to say most, if not all.
La mayoría, si no todas.
Anyone can go into a local garden shop and buy glyphosate products and others off the counter. For example, Roundup is the commercial name for one that my neighbor has and uses in her yard.
Y
And that's
después,
glyphosate.
la mayoría te venden
Monsanto.
muchos glifosatos de Monsanto, ¿no? Y que se utilizan en todos los jardines privados. Entonces, que me refiero que hay una cantidad de glifosatos enorme, entiendo. So, no, we are just was checking that all the private gardens, if they use glyphosates, so there will be a lot of glyphosates around the city. ¿no?
Yes,
Que se utilizan,
true.
entonces que hay muchos glifosatos en las ciudades.
it's
Okay,
true.
now because we were discussing, because in Europe it's forbidden and it's forbidden for the last year. Estoy diciendo que en Europa ya están prohibidos en los últimos años. And now it's you are under a penalty if you use it, and nobody uses it now in Spain.
Yes, well, that's a good example for the United States. And currently, I'll just share this little bit. You know, one of our roles, of course, is maintaining park trees, but other groups maintain the rest of the parks, the grass, the restrooms, things like that. And they have a practice in some parks of using glyphosate to create a ring around the tree so that they don't have to mow near it. They can mow quicker. And that's an example of one of the areas we're working on right now with our own colleagues in parks to get them to stop doing that. Because in the US, the understanding of the issues around glyphosate are not the way they are in Europe.
Que sigue ella en contra de los glifosatos, que ella lleva la parte de los árboles, pero que la gente que lleva la parte de praderas, etcétera, que pone glifosato alrededor del aro del árbol para que no crezca hierba, pero vamos, que entran en incoherencia, ¿no? Unos con otros, que no está de acuerdo, pero que está muy extendido el uso de glifosatos en todo Estados Unidos.
So there is one fungicide that we use routinely to treat specifically elm trees. It is an inoculant,
Vale,
that
hay un tipo de, hay un tipo de producto que sí que utilizan para utilizar sobre todo para los olmos, un tipo de fungicida. And which one is it? Sorry.
oof. Well, I can't remember the chemical name, but the commercial name is Arbatec. And we inject it into the root flares of large elm trees every 3 years to inhibit the spread of Dutch elm disease.
Se llama Arbotec, que es el nombre técnico, y se inyecta en las raíces de los elm, yo creo que elm es olmo, ¿no?
Olmos, sí.
Olmos, sí, de los olmos,
Ulmus, yep.
olmos maduros, y sobre todo para tratar un tipo de enfermedad que va directamente, eso se inyecta en las raíces cada 3 años.
Endoterapia.
I was trying to look up Arbatec, but it'll take me too long. Okay. I see a couple questions. Let's see. How often do you prune the trees of a sector or group of streets? Every 2 years, 3 years? Yeah. Great question, because it probably wasn't clear before, but we do not routinely, urban forestry, the city, does not routinely maintain street trees. The city's law is that the property owner adjacent to the street tree is responsible for tree maintenance. Go ahead.
No, the question was, how often do you prune the trees in the streets? Vale.
We don't. That's what I'm saying. The city
Vale.
doesn't. It's the adjacent property owner that has to do it.
¿Cada cuánto se podan los árboles en las calles? En las calles no se podan. No, you don't prune it in the streets,
Right.
but we have seen some volunteers before pruning handmade.
That's true. Yes. So we have volunteer programs, and those are where we have interested neighborhoods, mostly where they want to do some tree work, rather than it being part of a regular proactive street tree maintenance regime.
Vale. Que lo que hemos visto antes de gente que podaba son gente que se une y que pide que les enseñen a podar y que podan. No es una práctica extendida en toda la ciudad, sino que cuando hay gente lo hacen y aparentemente, ahora voy a preguntar, pero solo se deben de podar los árboles jóvenes que se pueden podar a mano a una altura sin escalera. Y yo creo que los árboles grandes parece que no se pueden podar. Sorry, Jane, the big ones, the big trees with big branches, you don't prune it in the middle of the streets?
So the way that works is when the street tree is adjacent to a city property, for example, in the picture here where they're planting, that's next to a park. So the adjacent property owner is us, and we maintain those trees, and we go selectively when, instead of routinely. So we don't go every X years. We go when there are issues noted, and I'll speak to that in a minute. Where street trees are not adjacent to public property, where they're adjacent to private property, it's the private property owner's responsibility to get a permit from us to have the tree maintained. And they would hire contractors to do the work that they couldn't reach themselves. And they don't do that much. Most of the street trees, because of that city policy, are not maintained or are not maintained well. And it's something we are really trying to get the city to change so that the city maintains street trees.
Sí, pues eso, yo creo que estábamos diciendo de que la mayoría no se podan y que los que están en zona privada es el privado el que lo poda. Entonces...
Okay. I think it's a unique policy. Most cities in the US, a street tree, which is city property, is maintained by the city. Portland, many years ago, decided otherwise.
Vale, sí, lo que estaba diciendo también, Ana, que lo has apuntado allí. Parece que los vecinos son también los que podan los árboles que parece que les molestan. Entonces, pero que esto es una cosa que solo se hace en Oregón, que en el resto de las ciudades, evidentemente, los árboles públicos se podan por la gestión pública. Pero aquí pues parece que había una digamos, norma anterior en que parecía que eran los vecinos los que pedían que se podara o que se podan. Tampoco me ha quedado del todo claro. Bueno, seguimos porque si nos doy la chapa. Mira.
Okay, I'm going to shift over to tree planting. In Portland, we created a tree planting strategy. It's called Growing a More Equitable Urban Forest. That title reflects the inequity in canopy distribution you saw earlier in the graphics on the slides. A lot of the canopy is west of the river, where only 20% of the people live, and the east side has very low canopy, where 80% of people live. So this is our plan to plant trees to remedy that. And that plan wasn't created just by the city. It was created with several focus groups from low canopy neighborhoods and also folks who are traditionally underserved by government. So usually people of color, also with other city bureaus, and one of the local universities was a partner in creating that strategy. The strategy identifies priority planting areas. Those are the places where we focus our resources. And those are the areas of the city that have low tree canopy and are also lower income neighborhoods. We update those priority planting areas every 3 years. Alberto, do you want to go now and then I'll finish?
Yeah, bueno, sí, básicamente lo que estábamos diciendo, pues que la estrategia de plantación era lo que más o menos veis allí, y sobre todo, pues hay en las zonas más desfavorecidas se trata de hacer un poquito más de hincapié, ¿no? Pero básicamente es lo que se pone allí. So then, Jane, we still, I think in the chat, we have some questions because I haven't been able to translate it correctly. How is the pruning in the streets? Is it by the neighborhood? Is it by the council? Is it and who decide and when and who pay it? Because I have not translated correctly. Sorry.
Okay, no worries. I'm amazed at how quickly you translate. I couldn't do that. But okay. So street trees we're talking about, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Ahora vamos a explicar los árboles de la calle públicos cómo se podan. Okay.
Árboles de la calle. If I have a street tree in front of my house, I'm required to maintain it.
Even if it's in a public place.
Yes.
A ver, si tú vives en una casa y hay un árbol enfrente de tu casa, aunque esté en una zona pública, parece que lo mantienes tú. O sea, sorry, because this is strange in Spain. If
it is.
In my private house, maybe I have a couple of trees, but now it's not the matter. In the street, in front of my house, there is a big tree. If it needs to be pruned, I need to be in charge of it.
That's right.
Vale, entonces lo he explicado.
So,
yo vivo en una casa, tengo un árbol delante, grande, pero en zona pública, árbol público, con ramas grandes. Si la quiero podar, me tengo que encargar. So now, Jane, how do I prune that tree? Or how many trees needs to be pruned? ¿Cómo se poda ese árbol? ¿Y cuántos árboles se podan? ¿Y quién lo decide? Okay.
So you, the property owner, would need to get a permit from us, Urban Forestry, to prune the street tree because it's city property. The permit would specify what type of pruning is permitted. And then the property owner has to make that happen, whether they do it themselves or hire a contractor to do it. And we have that contractor group that we train and we refer people to encourage them to use those. Vale. That's how that works.
Vale, funciona que si tú tienes un árbol que aparentemente lo quieres podar, porque aparentemente es una decisión del que vive delante, tienes que pedir el permiso oficial y entonces ellos te dicen cómo se poda, que lo puedes podar tú, entiendo, porque también hay mucha gente que sabe de jardinería, y si no, tienes que pedir ayuda y se tiene que podar en la forma oficial de podar que te marcan ellos, porque ellos digo, ayuntamiento no va a venir a podártelo. Entonces tienes que ser tú el que lo haga. So, and Jen, what happens if there are like 3 neighbors and 2 say, no, don't prune it because we want big tree, and 1 say, let's prune it because I don't like these branches? Estoy preguntando qué pasa si hay 3 vecinos y dicen 2, oye, no, dejarme los árboles bien, y llega uno que se le ha amargado, no, me lo podas todo, a ver qué pasa. Okay, so what happened in that moment?
Right, where somebody calls us and complains, or we see that a tree hasn't been maintained well, we can go and fine the property owner to make them do the work, or we can also have contractors do the necessary pruning under our permits, under forestry's permits, and then a lien is placed on the property owner's house so that they have to pay for the work that the city had done on the city's tree, but that was the responsibility of the property owner.
Pues sí, aparentemente era lo que habíamos dicho antes. Entonces, el que lo ha pedido que se pode, puede ser que le manden a una empresa y puede ser que incluso tenga que pagar que esa poda que se ha puesto allí.
So I want to do a little commentary here.
Okay.
this policy where the adjacent property owner is responsible for maintaining a street tree is something that we are advocating to have our city council change and make a city responsibility. And it's mostly about funding. We estimate it's a $17 million a year change to have the city pruning. It would be contractors. We would hire contractors to work under us to prune all the city street trees on a regular, proactive 10-year cycle. Because what we see happen is people don't maintain their trees. They don't know they're supposed to maintain their trees. They can't afford to maintain their trees, street trees. They do not want street trees planted because they know they will have to pay to maintain them when they get larger. So that policy is a burden and a barrier to our forestry goals and to property owners.
Tienen un problema con la normativa, porque la normativa, que es muy puntual en la ciudad de Oregón, te dice que tú tienes que podar los árboles públicos que están cerca de tu casa. Entonces, claro, la gente se mosquea y dice que no los poda. Y luego hay gente que se enfada o se cabrea si le plantan árboles nuevos. Entonces, que va incluso diciendo no, porque esto cuando crezca me lo voy a tener que comer yo. Entonces, que el ayuntamiento y están trabajando para cambiar eso. Cambiar eso significa que van a tener que meter 17 millones de dólares más o menos en un periodo de 10 años para podar de manera pública todos los árboles que hay en la ciudad. Los miles de árboles que se tienen que podar, pero que sea una empresa contratista y que sea un dinero público, pero que no tienen ese dinero y que, bueno, pues están en proceso de cambiarlo, que es una ley que es propia de Oregón, que saben que es complicada, de que la gente no lo entiende y que la gente va en contra del árbol, cosa que entonces lo que quieren hacer es cambiarla y que al final sea un trabajo público y que se haga por contratistas profesionales. Yeah.
I know that's hard because it doesn't make sense. So I know it has to be explained carefully.
Sí, pues okay. Ella sabe que esa es una decisión un poco extraña y errónea que tienen en la ciudad y que ella sabe que esa es controversia. Eso.
I'm seeing in the chat a question about liability in case of a branch drop that caused an accident. Who is liable for that? So under the laws in Portland, the adjacent property owner is responsible in that case because they are responsible for maintaining the tree. There are situations where the city will end up paying towards the liability if there's some city activity that may have been involved. But generally, because it is the property owner's responsibility to maintain the street tree at their home, they are the ones who are held responsible.
Even if the tree is in the public place or is in the private?
Street tree. If it's a street tree, even though it's publicly owned, the city's law is that the adjacent property owner has to maintain it. And so if that tree causes damage or injury, the adjacent property owner is liable.
Adjacent property? Sorry, I didn't get that.
Adjacent. So the tree in front of my house, I'm the adjacent property owner.
Okay,
I am
vale,
next to. Adjacent means next to.
Vale, okay.
Side.
Vale. Eso yo no lo sabía. Vale, entonces, si un árbol, había una pregunta muy bien hecha, que si un árbol cae una rama y daña un coche por 2.000 euros, un árbol público. Entonces diciendo, bueno, pues eso será del ayuntamiento. Pues no. Resulta que ese árbol le cae el marrón, para entendernos, al dueño más cercano porque no lo ha podado. ¿Vale? Entonces, pero bueno, que de vez en cuando, eso siempre hay movidas allí. Y entonces con los seguros, etcétera, y que están por cambiarlo. Y que si son árboles que parece que no son de nadie, es el ayuntamiento el que se queda, digamos, con ese daño. Pero que, bueno, que entiendo que ahí habrá problemas, sí. Gracias, Rosa. Adyacente. Bueno, el adyacente o el árbol pegado al árbol público pegado a tu casa.
I will come back to that street tree policy towards the end when I talk about challenges and opportunities. So.
Okay.
I'm going to switch back to planting right now.
Okay, vamos a la plantación.
We're nearing the end. So, okay. So we're focusing our planting in low canopy and low income neighborhoods. And we've been doing that just since 2018 because we got funding first for tree planting, dedicated for tree planting first in 2015. If you remember when I was talking about permits and regulations and that there are some cases where when a tree is removed, mitigation is paid into a fund. These mitigation funds are in this tree code, tree planting and preservation trust fund. That's our money for tree planting.
Vale, que también tienen una política de que cuando se tienen que lo que va en las multas o lo que se recauda de los cambios de árboles, etcétera, luego va a unos fondos para que se puedan hacer nuevas plantaciones.
And currently we are planting around 2,000 trees each year and also do 3 years of establishment care. That's watering in the summer for the most part and mulching and things like that. Watering in summer for new trees is essential in our climate in Portland, or they generally will not survive. And we increased from 2 years to 3 years just in the past few years because it's gotten hotter and drier in the summer here.
Okay. Que también más o menos plantan unos 2.000 árboles al año y que lo importante de la plantación, en un principio hacían 2 años de riego de apoyo en los 2 primeros años, pero que con el cambio climático eso ha ido cambiando y ahora son 3 años de mantenimiento. Do the neighborhoods need to irrigate the closest trees new that they had or no? The question that I have just put.
Yeah, whomever plants the tree is responsible for establishing it, for watering it. When we are the ones planting with city money, we take care of that for the first few years until the tree is established.
Vale. El que lo planta es el responsable de darle riego durante los años. Si lo ha plantado el ayuntamiento, lo mantiene el ayuntamiento. Si lo ha plantado el vecino en el alcorque del lado, pues será el vecino.
So in case you're interested, you could find the citywide tree planting strategy, growing a more equitable urban forest, on our website and see a lot of information about it. The upshot is we talked with a lot of residents to find out what their priorities for tree planting, for use of that tree planting and preservation trust fund money would be. And what we heard back from them is plant where there aren't enough trees and plant where people have lower incomes who need the most help. So that's what we're doing. That's what the plan says.
Yo creo que eso lo podéis mirar en la página web que te pone el programa de qué es lo que están haciendo, cómo están plantando y su estrategia. ¿Vale? ¿Sí?
Okay, I think I covered some of this already. Funding is from the mitigation payments that are collected in that tree planting and preservation fund. So when someone is issued a permit to remove a tree and for some reason they can't plant the tree back, they pay instead of planting into that mitigation fund that we use to plant trees. Also, sometimes when there are violations of city tree regulations, some of those payments go into the tree planting and preservation fund and we use it to plant trees in the city.
Vale, cuando la gente planta árboles, cuando tiene que quitar un árbol y plantar uno, a veces no pueden hacerlo y entonces lo que se hace es tienen que pagar un dinero. Ese dinero va a una especie de caja común que luego va para dedicarse a plantaciones en otras zonas.
And our focus is planting diverse species that are large form at maturity, native or otherwise well adapted to our climate as best we can, and evergreen trees. Those are goals in the city's urban forest management plan. These are the highest service trees. They give us the most benefits. So that's why we focus on those. So we don't plant smaller form trees generally. And we will only offer, when it's a voluntary planting program, we only offer large native and evergreen trees of various types so that people are encouraged to plant those instead of deciduous trees, non-native trees, not climate adapted trees or small form.
Vale, lo que ellos suelen plantar son árboles perennes, árboles nativos o árboles que se adaptan al cambio climático. Entonces no se ponen especies que no se van a adaptar y eso lo tienen como una de las, digamos, de las líneas rojas que no se debe pasar, no poner árboles que no pueden adaptarse al clima local de Oregón. Entonces tratan de utilizar casi siempre árboles autóctonos.
And the picture here is one of the 7 focus groups that helped us build that tree planting strategy.
Vale, esta es la foto. Han hecho varios focus group, que son agrupaciones normalmente de vecinos que ayudan a hacer la estrategia de plantación. Entonces, esta es una foto de uno de esos grupos.
A little bit about our staff that work on this. This is the tree planting for the city is in our science outreach and planting team. So the folks who do planning and policy and scientific analyses also run our planting programs. And that's actually two of the folks on the top picture. Also our tree maintenance team. So the folks who do the tree work, the climbers and those sorts of things also help with planting. That's one of them in the lower right picture with a bunch of bald and burlap trees to go out. Also our partners in our Parks Bureau, Horticultural Services, they care for shrubs, flower gardens, and turf across the city. They do a lot of tree procurement for us, so they'll buy trees to meet our specifications and get them delivered. And we also have contractors that we hire that work under our instruction to plant trees in various situations. And of course, as you've seen earlier in the presentation, volunteers and residents we work with to encourage them to plant trees, to plant the right trees, to plant them in the right places, and to plant correctly and take care of them.
Vale, mientras miramos esto, estos son fotos de gente en la plantación. Nos ha comentado que todo el personal normalmente que trabaja en el departamento está involucrado y todos hacen plantaciones, tanto los que hacen diferentes áreas, incluso los de la gente de oficina, cuando hay que plantar para involucrar a todo el mundo, la gente suele ir a plantar allí, a pisar, digamos, verde, para entenderlo.
I see a question from Patricio. What is the minimum planting space that you consider and what species are used in these cases?
Vale, las plantaciones, el espacio mínimo de plantación y qué tipo de plantación se hace.
The smallest space that we'll plant, street trees are generally the most restrictive, so I'll speak to street tree spaces. The space must be at least 4 feet wide. It can't be smaller. I'm sorry, at least 3 feet wide. It can't be smaller than that. We much prefer larger, and we're aiming towards getting it 4 feet as a minimum.
Vale.
Go ahead.
Hablamos de espacios mínimos, que estamos hablando ya solo de plantación en árboles, en calles, perdón, alcorques. Entonces, 3 pies de largo, que son unos 90 centímetros, el mínimo, pero que normalmente es entre 3 y 4. Estaremos hablando de entre 90 y 120 centímetros. Sorry, Jane, we are talking about 3 feet for 3 feet.
3 feet is it's a little less
than
than
it's like 1 meter, but it's like a square of 3 feet, 3 feet and 3 feet.
Oftentimes it'll be longer than that, but it's the space between the road curb and the sidewalk.
Sorry. Then how much soil do you have? The square of soil, if it's planted in sorry, because I translated in the wrong way. Perdón, lo que he traducido lo he traducido mal antes. 3 pies, que son 90 centímetros, es desde el borde de la carretera donde pasan los coches a donde se planta el árbol, al alcorque. Ahí hay 90 centímetros. Y ahora le estoy preguntando, ¿cuánto tiene el alcorque? How much is the place of the soil that you plant? The square normally.
Yeah.
How much is?
To make it easier, because other people have to do a lot of the work, because we're not in street trees, we don't use soil volume. So it's not about cubic whatever.
Yeah.
Instead, we use the planting width as the guide. So we'll say, here's the list of species that you can plant because your planting width is 3 feet, 5 feet, 6 feet. Instead of, so we don't use soil volume.
Vale, que no se utiliza, ellos no utilizan volumen de tierra, sino que depende de la especie, entiendo, y alguno igual me ayuda y lo traduce mejor que yo, dependiendo el tipo de árbol, hay un tipo de especie. Sorry, Jane, if you plant in the middle of a street, a tree normally will be 3 feet away from the traffic, okay, and then the soil, the square, or it will be a long time. Do you have like 4 feet, 5 feet, something like that, that needs to be, because it's all around concrete? How much is the place of soil?
Yeah.
¿Cuánto es la medida de un alcorque? Es que no sé cómo se dice alcorque.
Vale. The smallest space that will allow a tree to be put in, people are always trying to put them where they won't work, is 4 by 4.
Vale,
so
lo mínimo es 1,20 por 1,20, lo mínimo, el alcorque mínimo. Okay.
And that minimum is very low. We would like that to be higher. We need to work with, we need to convince other parts of the city, like the street designers, to build streets with more space for trees and for us to be able to speak of soil volumes, not just surface lengths.
Y que bueno, que
We're gonna get
normalmente
to that.
ese es el mínimo en calles pequeñas, pero que ellos tratan de hacer que cuando se diseñe la calle el corque sea un poquito más grande.
And an example of a species that we put in that small space is like dogwood trees, which are Cornus is the genus, Cornus florida, for example.
El arbolito más pequeño es el Cornus florida.
Really small trees that won't get more than, generally, especially in that habitat, won't get more than, say, what is it in meters? 3 meters tall, maybe 4. Those are not high service trees. They're not where we focus our planting efforts. Instead, we are focusing on getting streets designed to make more room for larger, more productive and longer lived trees.
Yeah, well, we're talking about trees in the middle of the streets if they are not in the traffic lights or the lights. So
yeah, with traffic, there what we do is we have requirements about how far a tree being planted has to be from certain things. For example, from an intersection, from a corner, no tree planting is allowed for 25 feet. I'm not sure how many meters.
Estamos hablando de las distancias mínimas que eso lo marca la normativa. Si hay un semáforo, si hay una esquina o si hay un tráfico, que el mínimo tiene que haber 25 pies o el mínimo tiene que haber tantos pies para facilitar la visión.
Your questions are great.
Yeah.
They are part of the challenges and opportunities that I'm going to get to at the end. Okay, let's keep going here to get to challenges and opportunities. So remember this, the canopy in Portland is inequitably distributed, very little on the east side of the city and a lot more on the west. This means, that our priority planting areas are on the east side where canopy is lowest. Here in dark green, you see the planting priority areas for last year. We update this map and our priority areas every 3 years. So this will change in the next 2 years. I can almost guarantee you that the priority planting areas will still all be on the east side of the river. The one exception is the downtown area that's west of the river. And the downtown area is tree deficient because it is so highly developed. It has a lot of hardscape. There's very little space for trees. And that gets back to what we were talking about with how much space for a tree. Portland needs to work a lot on improving that in that area.
Este es el plano más o menos que ellos tienen como estrategia de plantación. En la zona en verde oscura es donde tienen que plantar y donde primero tienen que plantar, que sobre todo son las zonas donde menos árboles hay. Y prácticamente todas las nuevas plantaciones van a ir allí. Entonces todo lo que veis son los barrios un poquito peores y las dos que quedan al lado del río en el centro, que es la parte vieja de la ciudad.
Okay, so summary, we have limited resources for tree planting. We've only had them for several years now, not many years. We focus on the areas of the city that are populated by low-income Portlanders, have low tree canopy, and are also usually historically underserved communities by government, so people of color.
Entonces, básicamente es que van a plantar solo, que no tienen mucho presupuesto, que se va a plantar solo donde más hace falta, que es donde están las zonas más desfavorecidas y donde vive la gente, normalmente gente de color o gente étnica, gente, entendemos que indígena, etcétera, que tiene pocos recursos y que sus barrios tienen pocos árboles y de mala calidad. Ahí es donde se va a hacer el mayor esfuerzo para tratar de equiparar la ciudad.
Okay, I forgot to credit this map. Portland State University Sustaining Urban Places Lab made this map. I did not, this image. So here we see that high heat areas correlate strongly with our priority planting areas. The dark outlined areas are the priority neighborhoods you saw on the previous map. And any area, the areas that are red are the hottest and the coolest areas are blue. On the upper left, you see a big blue area. That's Forest Park, that big forest that you saw a picture of earlier. So we're planting where it's hottest because there are fewest trees there.
Lo que veis es el mapa de calor y evidentemente donde hay menos árboles es donde más calor hace y es donde se está haciendo especial hincapié para plantar más. Y lo que veis en azul es toda la zona boscosa, que es el gran parque que nos hemos visto antes.
This past summer in Portland, we had what was called a heat dome effect for about 3 or 4 days. And surface temperatures in the city were 116, 117 degrees Fahrenheit.
Vale, que han tenido una ola de calor este verano
I'm trying
y
to convert
alguien
it.
lo puede traducir 116 Fahrenheit, que entiendo que estará en torno a los 42 grados, más o menos 3 o 4 días a esa temperatura. 116, 118 grados
47
Fahrenheit.
degrees Celsius.
Odo, 47, 47. This is called
Insane.
Sevilla, en España, Sevilla. Ok. 47 grados, Oregón.
Very
That's
hot.
hot. Eso es
It's ve- it was
calorcito.
it burned trees. We had sun scald damage on trees we'd never seen before. We had dozens of fatalities in some of the low canopy and low income neighborhoods in East Portland because it was so hot. And this is an illustration of why trees are desperately needed in those areas to provide shade and cooling. And also it's harder to plant there because it's getting so hot. It's harder to have trees survive.
Vale, que sobre todo esto, esta ola de calor tan grande mató muchos árboles y hay muchos árboles que con ese cambio climático pues no sobrevivieron. Y entonces por eso de la importancia de poner árboles y crear una masa arbolada en zonas que baje un poco también que unos árboles ayuden a otros a mantener una temperatura porque van a seguir viniendo olas de calor y que sobre todo unos se protejan a otros. Y por eso la máxima prioridad es plantar donde hay arbolitos pequeños y sobre todo lo que ha comentado antes de extender esos 2 años de riego que había antes de apoyo en árboles nuevos a 3 años. Okay.
Okay, as I said before, the finances, the money to plant trees is relatively new to us. So we've been ramping up our program to maximize those resources. You can see here that this winter is our planting season, not summer. This winter right now, we are aiming to plant 2,500 trees on city property, on streets, which are also a form of city property, as well as on private property. You may remember earlier in my presentation, the most opportunity for more trees is on private property. However, we have the least control there. On private property, we do yard tree giveaways, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So it's people who want trees, we help them plant them, we don't make them plant them.
Vale, esto es la gráfica de cómo ha ido evolucionando, que ellos son conscientes de que la mayor parte de los árboles se plantan en zonas privadas y también tienen una idea de apoyo a estos árboles privados porque les hacen un trabajo grande, ¿no?
Okay. And again, our goals for these trees are large form, evergreen, native, and climate resilient as much as possible.
Vale, las importantes para todos los árboles que se plantan, que sean perennes, que sean autóctonos, que sean resistentes al cambio climático.
Any trees that we plant or trees that we give to private property owners to plant, we monitor. Obviously, planting a tree is the beginning. Whether it survives and how it does is critically important. We monitor that it's actually there, it hasn't been taken out, that it's what condition it's in, how it's grown, and what type of care it's receiving.
Pues evidentemente cuando van plantando van haciendo un seguimiento, pues que el árbol sigue allí, cómo va creciendo, el tamaño, el cuidado, etcétera. Eso lo van haciendo el personal que lo planta.
And when it's city property, we follow up on these things. For example, if a tree that we planted is now gone for some reason, we plant another tree there in the next planting season. We try to find out what happened to it so it doesn't disappear again, and it happens sometimes. On private property, we will connect with the property owner and explain to them how they can better care for their tree whenever possible, if it's having issues.
Vale, las marras que tienen las vuelven a plantar al año siguiente y las que están en zona privada tratan de decirle al dueño privado por qué se les ha muerto y pues, para tratar de cambiar o la especie o el mantenimiento.
Okay, so now I'm going to describe some of our different planting programs. One of them is what we call yard tree giveaway. So we give them away, they're free, there's no cost. And these are specifically for private property trees that go in yards. Right now we're giving away around 1,500 trees a year. You can see the masks on the participants. These are folks who came to pick up trees, and we've had to make adjustments, as we all have all over the world because of COVID-19. We typically do 5 giveaway events each year, and those events are in the low canopy and low income neighborhoods where we're focusing our planting efforts. For some folks, we'll also deliver trees to their property to make it easier for them. And in some cases, we'll also help them plant their tree instead of them planting it by themselves. This is particularly for people who have physical disabilities and need that kind of assistance. And when we advertise for the free yard tree giveaways, we focus that advertising in the low income and low canopy areas of the city. Because remember, that's where we really are trying to use most of our resources in the highest need areas.
Que la estrategia de plantación sobre todo hacen unos sorteos, unos regalos de árboles, pero van en los barrios más desfavorecidos, a familias más desfavorecidas. La divulgación es todo allí, entonces que se hace y siempre son árboles perennes y con los condicionantes que tenían, y luego cuando hay gente, por ejemplo, mayor o gente que es incapaz de plantar un árbol por condiciones físicas o por cualquier otro motivo, ellos a veces les ayudan, tanto con voluntarios como ellos mismos. Pero es una de las maneras de tener más árboles en la ciudad de una manera relativamente más fácil.
Okay, I see there's another question. Will you use some strategies or methods to optimize the irrigation water in trees? Yes. Trees that are maintained by the city, we have folks go and water them, and we use a specially designed deep watering rod to water trees. That's the most effective way to encourage deep root growth.
Okay, I'm going to explain this one, sorry.
Okay.
La pregunta era cómo se ayuda a los árboles cuando hay una plantación o cómo se riega. Entonces, los árboles que son públicos, sí que el mantenimiento es público y hacen un riego de profundidad. Okay.
And where it's newly planted trees that are not on property managed by the city, we encourage folks to water their trees at least 15 gallons a week during the summer, and encourage them to get watering bags, which are plastic or rubber tubes with holes in the bottom that go around the trees, or to use buckets and put some holes in the buckets, fill the bucket and let it drip down.
Vale, y los árboles privados les dice a la gente que hagan al menos 3 tipos de riego. Son unos 15 galones, que son unos 60 litros en verano, no sé si todos los días. Y luego también los tubos de aireación que van por debajo, y luego también cubos agujereados, pues para permitir que los árboles se vayan regando.
We tell people they cannot overwater trees here in the summer. 15 gallons, which is going to be a lot more in liters.
60 liters, more or less.
60 liters a week is a minimum.
Vale, 60 litros a la semana, que me he quedado antes a medias, 60 litros a la semana, que es más que suficiente, pero que ellos dicen a la gente que no rieguen, que no inunden a los árboles de agua. Okay, sorry, carry on.
No worries. Okay, I think I'll just go to the next one.
So you were saying that the people do not need to irrigate you teaching, no? Not to irrigate the new
during tree establishment, which is anywhere from planting to 7 years, we consider the establishment period for a tree. The most important part is the first 3 years in our climate. During that period, we teach that you cannot overwater a tree. It's just so dry and hot here in the summer, and that tree has gone through such shock, that young tree being uprooted, roots cut, planted in a new environment. And also our experience is that folks aren't always on top of the watering. They're not overly ambitious about it, so we need to really encourage them. Therefore, we say water as much as you can, at least 60 liters a week. more if you can, and as deep as you can. So not just on the surface, but getting it to soak down as much as possible.
Dice que el periodo de asentamiento del árbol, que está en torno a los 7 años, los 3 primeros son los más importantes. También es importante de que no lo rieguen demasiado, pero que también es importante que lo rieguen, que sepan regarlos en profundidad y que no se dediquen a riegos superficiales. Entonces, más o menos van tratando de enseñar a la gente.
Okay, I'm shifting to a different type of planting program we have. This, instead of yard trees now, we're talking about street trees. In that top picture, there's a great illustration of street trees in relatively small spaces. It's probably a 4-foot wide planting strip. We have a program there that we call Opt Out. We plant street trees for free and give them establishment care for 3 years for free if the adjacent property owner is amenable. Remember, in Portland, the regulation is that next door property owner is responsible for the tree. And so we will come to property owners and say, you've got a spot for a tree. We would like to plant a tree for free, take care of it initially. Then you will have to take over its care because that's the city's rule. Do you want a tree? If they say yes, we plant the tree for them. Again, they're large form native evergreen as much as possible.
Vale, esto es lo que contábamos antes, que en España sería complicado. Les dicen, a ver, los vecinos que quieran un árbol que lo digan. Vale, pues vosotros queréis un árbol como esto de la foto, os lo plantamos, pero los 3 primeros años lo mantenemos nosotros, pero luego tú, que eres el que lo has pedido, te quedas con el mantenimiento de los árboles, regar, podar, etcétera. Entonces, pues bueno, si no piden, no se pone, y si lo piden, se pone, pero con el mantenimiento y el consentimiento, porque la ley está así en Portland, de que ellos van a ser los mantenedores de esos árboles en el futuro.
So the reason we do opt out is because of that city regulation that the adjacent property owner must maintain the tree instead of the city maintaining the tree. When we worked on growing a more equitable urban forest, as well as many published studies in the US, we know that if a property owner has to maintain the street tree, they are often burdened by that, feel that they can't afford it literally, and don't want the street tree. We have the authority to plant street trees in any street space that we deem appropriate. However, because the property owner will be burdened with that maintenance, we ask them if they want us to continue planting. If they say no, then we will not plant a tree there. We'll come back in a few years if the property ownership has changed.
Vale, como ellos saben que es una medida controvertida, lo que te planten un árbol y que luego lo tengas que mantener, por eso preguntan a los dueños de las casas si quieren que se le planten árboles, y si dicen que no y se ponen rotundamente que no porque no los van a mantener o no pueden permitirse mantener, pues de momento no los plantan, y los plantan en otro sitio donde haya gente que los haya pedido.
So another way, at least in the US, that street trees get planted pretty commonly is called opt-in or yard trees, where it'll be advertised that we will plant free trees and people sign up to have trees planted. What we've found, and also what research by folks like the US Forest Service have found, is that when we do that kind of opting in, it's usually the more affluent, educated, more privileged property owners who take advantage of that and plant trees. Remember, our focus is getting more trees where canopy is too low and folks have lower income. So if we offered opt-in, we wouldn't be getting close to our goals. That's why we've gone with opt-out, where we go and find the locations and we approach the property owner and encourage them. We're honest with them that they have to do the maintenance after 3 years, and they have the option to opt out. Our opt-out rate, like people we approach, almost 50% say they do not want a street tree. The number one reason for that is that they will have to maintain it in the long run.
Vale. La gente está bastante concienciada en la ciudad, que sabe que si te ponen un árbol lo tienes que mantener. Las zonas más ricas, esos no tienen problema, porque cuando van allá a plantar todos están a favor de que les planten, y prácticamente casi todos dicen que sí. En las zonas más degradadas, las zonas más pobres, se encuentran con una oposición más o menos de la mitad. El 50% de la gente dice no me plantes un árbol porque no lo puedo mantener o no lo quiero mantener. y por eso están tratando de cambiar esa política para que en las zonas más degradadas sea el ayuntamiento donde al final lo tenga que mantener, aunque se salte un poco a la torera, porque si no, esas zonas nunca van a estar repobladas, que son las zonas donde hace más falta.
Last thing I'll mention about opt-out is when we are looking for places to plant street trees, we find a lot of challenges, a lot of conflicts. For example, water meters. Our water department requires that trees not be planted within a certain distance of water lines and water meters. Also where utility vaults are for electric in the right of way, or sewer lines, utility poles, street lights. And this is one of the areas we're trying to get other parts of the city of Portland's government to change their standards and consolidate the built infrastructure to make more room for trees in the streets.
Un problema que tienen, que es un problema interno de gestión dentro del ayuntamiento, es que en las zonas más degradadas la gente también se apiña más, están todas las casas más juntas, tienen menos espacio y hay menos espacio en las aceras, hay más tuberías que pasan juntas, hay más cables y entonces es más difícil plantar. Entonces ellos están allí en una lucha continua con otros departamentos para que les dejen más sitio para plantar árboles, pero a veces se encuentran problemas físicos de espacio y problemas de que la comunidad no quiere que les planten árboles.
This is a graph showing our tree planting and preservation fund, where there's those regulatory mitigation payments go, and how we have been using it since we began in 2018. As you can see, our goal is to maximize that fund as much as we can and plant as many trees as possible. The expenses in light blue, that's just the tree materials cost and contractors. We have contractors that plant street trees instead of staff. It is not the staff expenses. That would be a higher number if our staff were included. The staff we consider baseline. Any additional funds we get, the same staff can, in effect, cause more trees to be planted.
Vale, básicamente es una gráfica del coste de la plantación, en lo que sí que se va viendo que las medidas estas de ir plantando en la calle pues han ido subiendo y ahora están en torno a los 2.000 ejemplares más o menos al año y subiendo.
Okay. Oh, went too far. Hang on. Let me go back. Here we go. Okay, the scale of Portland's tree need. So I gave you some information, some data on how many trees are in Portland and what property types they're on, and also the extent of canopy cover. So currently we're at around 30.7% at average canopy cover. Our last measurement, we measured every 5 years. The increase was smaller than in previous years. And right now we're remeasuring it and we are seeing a slight decline in canopy, so going in the wrong direction. We know that from our own studies, we could get as much as 75% more trees in the city, roughly 1.3 million more trees. And also on street trees, we have, as you've heard, 118,000. We also know from our inventories and surveys that there are 90,000 viable empty street tree locations. So there are many, many opportunities to plant more trees in Portland. However, using the funds that we have, maximizing them as best we can, we will plant 3,200 trees a year, nowhere near the amount that we could plant.
Vale, que con los recursos, con el tiempo y con las posibilidades que tienen, son conscientes de que les faltan muchos árboles, muchos alcorques vacíos, muchos árboles por poner, pero que tienen más o menos, estirando su presupuesto, su gente, etcétera, llega a los 3.200 árboles al año y que eso es insuficiente para ellos, pero que bueno, están trabajando en para tratar de mejorarlo.
At the current rate of us planting around 3,200 trees per year, it would take us 28 years to fill the 90,000 empty street tree locations and 406 years to plant 1.3 million trees.
Bueno, que al ritmo que van, dice que en 28 años llenarán todos los alcorques vacíos, 28 años, que eso es bastante, y en el 2400, dentro de 400 y pico años, tendrán el 1.300.000 árboles. O sea que me parece que no lo vamos a ver.
Okay. I'll pause here for any questions before moving on to the final part of the presentation, which is challenges and opportunities.
Okay, we go to the last one. If we do any question, we do it the last. Vamos a ver el último punto y si alguna pregunta ya para el final, ¿vale? Porque vamos justitos de tiempo.
Okay, so on to challenges and opportunities with Portland's urban forests. So our prevailing challenge is climate change. The climate crisis isn't coming, it's here. We're seeing it very dramatically in Portland. These pictures are just some examples of what we're seeing. And we anticipate that it will get harder to be a tree in the Pacific Northwest over the next many years. What we're seeing in these two pictures, these are two recently planted trees. This is the peak of summer. They should be green. Their foliage is not normally brown or red. And you're also seeing some of the reason that these trees aren't doing well with high temperatures, high summer heat. All of the hardscape, the sidewalk, the road, and then the rock that's in the planting strip, those are just holding and radiating that heat, and it's just too much for those trees to take. On the right, go ahead, I'll continue.
Estamos viendo de algunos, entre comillas, errores de plantación. Dos árboles están en mitad del verano que deberían de estar verdes, están de color ya ocre porque están en unas zonas tan aislados y tanto el asfalto como el hormigón como las piedras reflejan todo el calor y los árboles están achicharrando allí.
And the photo on the right is a young western red cedar. The scientific name for that is Thujapakata.
Cedro rojo.
That is a native red cedar to the Pacific Northwest. Also a really important tree culturally to indigenous communities. And these trees are some of the first entire species we're seeing negatively impacted by the climate crisis. There's a well-documented decline in western red cedars across the Northwest. We are now planting fewer of them and only in prime habitat. They prefer shadier, cooler, moister soils and locations. And at present, we don't offer them a lot, for example, in our yard tree giveaways, because the likelihood is they'll die unless it's ideal habitat.
Este es otro ejemplo del cambio climático. Me parece que es un cedro rojo, que es un árbol también muy apreciado por los indígenas de los indios que vivían allí y que ahora está teniendo unos problemas de crecimiento muy grandes, que solo están viviendo los que se plantan en zonas ya con cierta sombra, boscosas y con buen terreno, que el cambio climático les está afectando mucho y que ellos ya casi deciden, antes que había muchos de estos, ahora están decidiendo cambiar a otro tipo de especie que son más resistentes.
So western red cedar is one example of a species that's being really decimated by the climate crisis. Others are as well. And the heat dome effect that I mentioned before that we had this summer where it was 47 degrees Celsius, trees that normally are quite heat resistant even were impacted. It was a deadly event for people and trees.
Esto es todo consecuencia del cambio climático, toda esta ola de calor está matando a los árboles y estos son los primeros que están afectados y hay otras especies que también lo están, por eso ahora tienen que estar cambiando la estrategia hacia árboles que puedan soportar olas de calor muy intensas.
So this is a photograph from the United States Forest Service. That's a federal agency that manages public property trees and also has programs for private and city properties to manage their trees. They did some estimates in California of forest area, so public lands that are heavily forested, thousands and thousands of hectares. And this survey is from 3 years ago, and they're finding lots of dead trees, the explanation for which appears to be the climate crisis. In this picture, anything that's brown or red is supposed to be green and is dead. So big challenge, the biggest challenge we've seen for the forests in Portland and elsewhere.
que tienen los bosques, estos son de California y también están en los bosques cercanos a Portland, tienen un problema con el cambio climático. Todos estos árboles que vemos de color ocre tendrían que estar verdes y todos estos o se están muriendo o lo están pasando muy mal o algunos ya están muertos, cosa que no les había pasado antes porque ya son zonas boscosas consolidadas con árboles maduros. Entonces, que el cambio climático les está afectando.
I'm seeing Patricio's comment. Thank you, Patricio. Yes, this is the northwest of the United States is not unique, nor is Chile. We're seeing this in various ways in different species and forest types around the globe. Okay, back to that topic you've come to know so well, street tree maintenance. This is another significant challenge and opportunity for the city of Portland. As you've learned, street trees are city property and require permits from the city to do any sort of work on, and they provide services to all residents. However, our city's rules are that the adjacent property owner, the property owner next to the tree, is required to maintain that tree. And we know this from studies as well as our own observations that this policy is indeed a burden and a barrier and prevents us from having street trees and from having appropriate street tree maintenance. We don't have studies around this because we don't have really the tools to do such a study, but we're quite certain also that the lack of maintenance of street trees from this policy means we have a lot more tree emergencies that we're responding to 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in Portland.
Sí, básicamente era lo que estábamos comentando antes, que la política de que los vecinos tienen que mantener el árbol más cercano a ellos, pues es una barrera para que puedan crecer en número de especies y pues eso, que están tratando de mejorarlo.
Most cities in the United States, street trees are city property and are maintained by the city, not by the adjacent property owner.
Sí,
Los
pues
Angeles, New York City, San Diego, Salem, Oregon, Eugene, Oregon, Chicago, the list goes on. Portland and a few smaller cities in our vicinity are the exceptions where it's the adjacent property owner's responsibility.
Me comenta que esa ley de que tienes que mantener el árbol cercano es solo prácticamente de Portland y de algunas otras ciudades pequeñitas. El resto de las ciudades americanas, árbol público lo mantiene la entidad pública.
And how we're working on that right now is we have done studies with a consultant of what it would cost for the city to assume maintenance of street trees and how we might implement that if it were funded. We've made 2 presentations to our city council about it. And right now, since we just had this heat dome effect and Portlanders died because of the high heat, people are, I think, more often recognizing the need for trees and street trees, at least to mitigate heat. And so there's a little more interest now. So we continue to provide information and present. We're also doing our own research in the Parks Bureau on how it might be funded, like what new money could be found so that it would be easy for the elected officials in Portland to change the policy to city maintenance of street trees.
Sí, lo que estaba comentando de que quieren hacer ese cambio a que todos los árboles públicos sean mantenidos por zonas públicas, pero eso es un incremento en su presupuesto que no lo tienen, que lo están valorando y que la gente ahora está más concienciada cuando tiene esas olas de calor y pasa tanto calor y que se da cuenta que en las zonas más arboladas está mejor. Ahora es cuando la gente está cambiando también el chip, en la que quiere más árboles cerca de su casa.
Okay, I borrowed this image from my colleagues in Portland's Bureau of Transportation, the street and traffic people. And it's a picture from Japan. It's not in Portland. And I use it a lot because this picture has everything happening in a street that we would see in Portland. There are bikers, there's commercial development, there are bus stops, there are street lights, traffic signals, heavy traffic, crosswalks, and in spite of all of that, they still have large street trees. They are a monoculture from the looks of it, which is not a great idea, but this is what we're aiming for in Portland. And the things I just listed, they're all about the design of a street. Portland has a lot of, shall we say, opportunities to design streets better so that trees, as well as everything else that's needed in the right of way, can be present.
Lo que vemos ahí no es Portland, es una ciudad en Japón y la utiliza ya Jane como diciendo que todo lo que vemos en la foto es lo que está en las calles, los semáforos, las paradas de autobús, los ciclistas, la gente, los semáforos, los pasos de cebra, pero todo eso convive con los árboles. Solo le veo una pega que es el mismo tipo de árbol, que no hay una biodiversidad, pero que quieren trabajar para ir hacia calles de este estilo.
Okay, I just have a couple more slides.
Yeah.
More challenges and opportunities, tree preservation. We do have regulations in Portland, as you know, that prohibit tree removal, cutting down trees. However, on private property, where most of our trees are, they are limited. There is a lot of tree removal that doesn't require a permit in the city of Portland, especially on private property. Any tree, for example, that is smaller than 12 inches diameter at breast height, so about the size of a dinner plate, anything smaller than that doesn't require a permit. It can be removed at any time. Of course, if you're cutting down the smaller trees, you never get the bigger trees, right? So that's a real issue. Also, say that and then I'll catch up.
Ella sigue diciendo que, bueno, que el mayor problema que siguen teniendo es que se ponen a plantar árboles y tratan de hacer mucho esfuerzo en plantar árboles, pero que hay una normativa que cualquier persona puede cortar un árbol en zona privada, que es donde se encuentran prácticamente el 70% de los árboles, que sea de un diámetro inferior, era lo que decíamos antes, de un plato de comida, más o menos, de cualquier árbol. Entonces, que esos árboles se pueden cortar sin ningún tipo de permiso, que no tienes que informar a nadie y que la gente cuando corta esos árboles es un trabajo que puede ser un árbol que ya tenga más de 10 años, pero que aún no ha alcanzado entonces que aunque quieren trabajar en eso para proteger a los árboles, porque cargándote árboles que se quitan cientos de árboles de esos todos los años, pues es que nunca llegan a tener muchos árboles.
So in the US, that is private property regulation is always controversial. Some feel that the private property is theirs to do with what they want, and having government regulate private property is often complicated. And that's most likely why Portland has some, but not a lot, of regulations on private property trees.
Ese es el problema que chocan con las leyes estatales a nivel nacional en Estados Unidos, que la propiedad privada se defiende a capa de espada, que por lo tanto la gente dentro de su casa puede hacer lo que le dé la gana y eso incluye los árboles. Entonces es complicado poder hacer una normativa que les permita cuidarlos.
The photo on the left is a library. It's the Millar Library, which is part of Portland State University. And here is an example of more progressive design to retain trees, keep them. The property owner here, the university, chose to build around a very large beech tree, Fagus. This one's a European beech, Fagus sylvatica, which now is also a heritage tree, so it has highest protection. You can't really tell in this picture, but it's a huge, beautiful tree. This is one of the few property development projects in Portland that has tried to really preserve trees and build with and around them. Go ahead.
Lo que vemos ahí, el edificio de la izquierda que tiene esa forma curva, es la biblioteca de la universidad, que tiene esa forma curva porque ya estaba ese árbol allí y entonces dijeron, bueno, esto es un ejemplo de cómo se protege un árbol, ¿no? Ese árbol que ya tenía en gran porte, se hizo este edificio, pero se hizo alrededor del árbol, respetando el árbol, ¿no? Que tampoco es una cosa muy común, pero como diciendo, se ve como un ejemplo de protección de árboles.
Most property development in Portland seems to try to maximize the square footage of the building. And this is important, the city's tree regulations, when a private property is being developed, are not very extensive. In fact, the property owner, when they're building on their property, can remove any tree on the property, regardless of its size, except if it's one of the 3 heritage trees, so there are a few of those, as long as they pay mitigation that goes into that planting fund. But a tree like this on the property at the library isn't required to be kept if they decide to build a new library or put an addition on. They can choose to keep it, or they can pay mitigation for it, maybe plant some other trees as well. So that part of our tree code doesn't protect trees really at all. It just requires payment sometimes.
La normativa de Oregón y de Portland, si tú compras una parcela, un terreno, con ella puedes hacer lo que quieras. Si tienes 20 árboles, te los puedes cargar, a no ser que sea uno de los 300 de patrimonio, que es muy difícil, evidentemente. Pero, por ejemplo, este árbol que veis en la foto, este no estaba catalogado como un árbol, lo podían haber talado, pero decidieron no hacerlo. Y entonces, pues esa es una de las cosas que tú entras en una parcela que has comprado, te cargas todos los árboles, pagas por ello, eso sí pagas, depende el porte que tengan y el tipo de árbol que sea, pero pagas y ya está, ellos los plantarán en otro sitio. Entonces tratan de hacer medidas más restrictivas para proteger a los árboles.
Okay, and Portland's tree regulations, as you can tell, there is a difference between regulations when there's development on a private property and there's not development on a private property. When there is development happening, that's where there are the fewest tree regulations, and that reflects the city decision makers' value of increasing housing and folks being able to develop their property.
Vale, ok. Y sobre todo también que no es la misma regulación la que es para casas privadas o la que es para edificios, digamos, públicos. Eso sí que tienen, normalmente suelen respetar los árboles, pero el metro cuadrado, como es caro como en todos los lados, se defiende de construir la casa y te lleva por medio de los árboles. Eso tampoco pasa nada.
And then the cartoon on the right illustrates a really common situation we see in Portland, which really comes down to folks just not having enough knowledge about how to maintain trees and how to help trees where there are infrastructure conflicts. So the illustration is there's a tree that appears to be lifting up the sidewalk. And of course, the conversation is cut it down. It's lifting up the sidewalk. From an urban forester or arboriculturalist or tree lover's perspective, there is no need to cut the tree down in this case. The sidewalk can be modified, and in some cases, the tree roots can be pruned and modified. So you still have a sidewalk and you still have a tree. Those practices are not as routine and common in Portland. It's getting better, and it's a goal that we have that all of our property owners and other bureaus in the city engage with us to find solutions that retain trees.
Lo que veis en el cómic allí es más o menos para qué es lo que está pasando. Entonces el árbol está diciendo, un día seré tan alto que daré oxígeno a todo el mundo y seré pues la delicia del barrio más o menos. Y los dos que están a la derecha diciendo, bueno, vamos a cargarnos, ¿qué hace este maldito árbol aquí? Córtalo ya. Entonces diciendo, bueno, cuando se plantea así que un árbol te hace más pequeño una vía de peatones o las raíces levantan el pavimento, que se debe de hacer una intervención, digamos, más respetuosa con el árbol, levantarlas, proteger las raíces, etcétera, pero no llegar a cortar lo que son cosas como estas son las que tratan de divulgar y enseñar a la gente de Portland. So we go almost with the last one, no, Jane? Because,
yeah, we're getting close here. Let me see what we've got.
Great.
I was told I had till 12 my time, which is more than half an hour.
Espera, hold on. ¿Vamos bien de tiempo? José Luis.
Vamos ya justos. ¿Tienes alguna pregunta en el chat, Alberto?
Sí, pues espera, pues ahora la miro porque es que estoy ya, vale, que la miro. Okay, so this is we are almost running out of time. Okay. So let me see if I collect a couple of questions and you say the last one and then we answer the last ones if you want.
Okay, I will go really quickly. This is some more challenges and opportunities in Portland are having tree-friendly or tree-forward designs. Picture on the left is a park that was built in 2017. It has very few trees in it, could have had a lot more. The one on the right is a new building that was constructed, And you can see in the sidewalk, there's a number of different colored areas. Those are all in-ground utilities that took the place of trees. Those utilities could have gone elsewhere. And along the same lines, we have some other infrastructure bureaus like our water department that is requiring certain offsets that are very large. Trees can be a lot closer to water pipes, for example, than folks think, including our water engineers. So this is just an example of where these trees that you see under the blue would no longer be allowed to be planted because our water bureau has said there must be 10 feet between the tree and a pipe that's under the road, 3 feet under the road.
Aquí vemos, por ejemplo, algunos tipos de árboles que están plantados en zonas donde no deben de plantarse porque hay tuberías o hay redes, etcétera, que van a pasar y va a acabar teniendo un problema seguro.
And here you see, these are the trees that we just saw in the overview that would no longer be allowed to be planted. And clearly they've been there a long time and there have been no water pipe conflicts. Yet our colleagues in the Water Bureau now require these types of trees not to get planted. It will be thousands of trees in the city if that policy isn't fixed, that won't get planted.
Aquí, por ejemplo, vemos otro tipo de árbol que se ha hecho demasiado grande, que va a afectar a las canalizaciones cercanas y que es un tipo de árbol que no se permitiría plantar ahora.
Okay, this is just a summary of the challenges. Tree retention. So keeping the trees we have is the very first place to start with any urban forest management and expansion. The climate crisis, of course, is creating big impacts, many of which are not predictable. Portland has a distinctive canopy inequity problem that we're trying to rectify. The street tree maintenance policy in Portland is a key challenge. Also, the allocation of space for trees in private property design and in streets is a challenge and an opportunity. And all of these things, because of how our city's population is distributed, disproportionately impact folks who are lower income and communities of color.
Bueno, esta es sobre todo una de las diapositivas finales que lo que tiene que hacer sobre todo es no cortar más árboles, no talar nada, mantener lo que hay y luego pues sobre todo fomentar las otras zonas que son más deficitarias.
So the good news for us in Portland is our residents voted overwhelmingly to provide a lot more funding to the parks program, including urban forestry. And so we are basically working on all those challenge areas, as well as increasing our tree planting with those new funds. And we have not in the past in Portland been able to proactively, systematically maintain our park trees. It's only been reactive. When somebody sees something and they call, we go. The funding also will help us develop a system where we can go and maintain trees in every developed park on a 10-year cycle.
Vale, pues aquí es el resumen de que sobre todo ellos van a seguir trabajando en el mantenimiento, en extender la red de plantaciones, en regularlo sobre todo y sobre todo también en tratar de divulgarlo y involucrar a la gente.
Yeah, and the levy will basically double our resources and our staff to do this work.
Van a tratar de doblar los recursos que tienen para hacerlo.
And that's the end of the presentation. If there are any
That's
more
the end. Great. Bueno, pues esto es el final. Entonces, yo no sé.
Y un par de preguntas, Alberto.
Sí, pues vale. A ver, yo creo, there's a couple of questions. Bueno, como había varias, somebody from Latin America is telling us if you need to do a strategy for trees in a city that have nothing written or nothing in the, what would you start? In which things would you start?
Great question.
¿Con qué empezarías en un sitio donde no hay una política de arbolado iniciada?
I think it depends on the form of government and the politics. In some places, the first step that I would see is getting a lot of public support for having trees and tree plans. In other, where that's the form of government, right? Where the public has influence on decision makers. Where not, then one needs to demonstrate to decision makers why trees are so important and why they need them. And there's no better time to do it than now with the climate crisis and the high heat we're seeing in a lot of places. there's a lot of research as well as examples from other cities of what should be done and can be done that will help make that case.
Vale, sobre todo, lo primero que haría es una labor de divulgar, ¿no? De divulgar la importancia de los árboles, de tener a la gente a favor desde el inicio y de, sobre todo, tener recursos económicos para, una vez que lo tienes, empezar a plantar de una manera coordinada, organizada, no digamos sin ton ni son, y sabiendo más o menos lo que haces con el tipo de especies que necesitas, etcétera, pero con la gente a favor, ¿no? Que la gente proteja los árboles. Y había alguna otra pregunta más, pero yo no sé dónde está. Yo creo si la quieres... Perdió el chat, si acaso, José Luis. Yo no sé si quieres hacer tú la última.
Tiene dos preguntas. Hay una sobre...
Espera, ¿dónde lo tengo?
Si el Departamento de Árboles de Portland tiene una división de viverismo producción de árboles.
Okay.
Si tiene externalizado el servicio y quién decide cuáles son las especies producidas.
For the new trees, do you have in the council the nursery or do you buy it?
Good. We do not have our own nursery.
¿No tienen vivero?
We purchase trees from commercial sources.
Compran.
Oregon is the state in the US that has the most nurseries of any state. There are lots of places for us to get good stock.
Oregón está lleno de viveros, por lo tanto tienen donde elegir.
And Parks used to have a nursery, but we stopped because there were so many good commercial nurseries in the area.
Vale, que antes tenían el departamento de Portland tenía un vivero público, pero que dejó de tenerlo porque los precios comerciales y las ofertas comerciales eran mucho mejores.
Vale, luego hay una pregunta de Eugenio que dice que ha observado en sus múltiples viajes por Estados Unidos, que me consta.
Yeah, sorry, Jane,
¿Me
you mind to stop sharing so we can see each other?
Yes.
Sí, perdona, ahora.
Eso es. Lo que pasa es que ahí, a ver, que perdemos el chat. Pues eso, que árboles de gran porte levantan los caminos de hormigón con frecuencia. Supongo que cortan las raíces, pero a partir de ahí no se están muriendo lentamente por infección del cuello del árbol. Es un problema importante que tienen o son mínimos, según su experiencia. O sea, los árboles de gran tamaño levantan las aceras, ¿no? Entonces, ¿cuál es la solución? Que si cortan las raíces y que si eso supone un
when you have big trees that the roots are moving the pavement, what do you do in that moment? Do you cut the roots or do you do anything with that trees?
There are a number of different ways to approach that. The first thing we try to do is adjust the sidewalk or the pavement. So cut around the tree or create ramps.
Vale, lo primero que tratan de hacer es salvar las ramas, cortar el pavimento y hacer una rampita por encima de las raíces. Okay. Second.
And then the second option is what can we do with the tree? So we will do root pruning where certain roots are cut back or removed, but the tree is retained, so it's still a successful tree.
Alguna de las opciones es cortar, hacer una poda de raíces, pero sabiendo qué raíces se poda sin matar al árbol.
And if neither of those approaches and those different tools work, sometimes the tree has to be removed if it can't be remedied.
Y si no se puede hacer ninguna de las dos, tendrán que mover el árbol, aunque algunos entiendo que no se podrán mover. Okay.
Perfecto, pues no sé si no hay más preguntas, como ya es tarde, Alberto, pues casi que le agradezcas por tu parte, de parte de todos, la experiencia, el haberla podido escuchar. Y bueno, yo por mi parte le voy a decir, Jen, it has been a pleasure listening to you. Students from Chile, Mexico, Brazil, Guatemala, and of course Spain have participated today. Thank you very much for participating, and we hope to see you soon in Spain. You are invited to discover our urban forests.
Well, thank
you.
Very much. You're welcome, and thank you for the invitation. I would love to get back to Europe soon.